Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax. Ditching a passenger jet on the open ocean, miles away from land, is something that very few pilots have ever attempted. To do that, we would have to deal with huge waves, long rescue times, possible sharks and very cold water. So even if the ditching would be successful, survival would be far from guaranteed. But it has actually happened a few times in history, and one of those took place in the spring of 1970 with the obscure US charter company Overseas National Airways. ONA, as it was known, was a carrier specializing in military cargo contracts, charters as well as lease agreements with other airlines. And back in 1970, they operated a fleet consisting of Douglas DC-8s, DC-9s as well as several Lockheed Electras. During the year before, ONA had been approached with a lease agreement proposal from ALM, Antillian Airlines, which at that time was a subsidiary of Dutch KLM and the flag carrier of the Netherlands Antilles. ALM operated a route network connecting various Dutch-controlled islands in the Caribbean, including Aruba, Curaçao and St. Martin, but they were now also looking to expand by adding a direct flight between St. Martin and New York City, using a leased ONA aircraft. St. Martin is a small Caribbean island located about 270 kilometers east of Puerto Rico, which is notable for being split almost 50-50 between France and the Netherlands. The island is served by Princess Juliana International Airport, located on the Dutch side of the island, and you might already know about it thanks to viral videos of people trying to stand up against jet blast on Maho Beach, which is not something I recommend, by the way. Today, Princess Juliana Airport can handle aircraft as big as Boeing 747s, but back in 1970 the airport was much less developed and the runway was only 5,249 feet long with water at both ends. That made it too short for ONA's 4-engine DC-8s, but ONA's CEO managed to convince ALM that the flights to New York could still be operated using their 2-engine DC-9s. Now, using a DC-9 on this route was technically possible, but also quite difficult in practice. You see, while a DC-9 could easily land on St. Martin's short runway, most models didn't have enough range to fly non-stop between there and New York unless they were very lightly loaded. The only DC-9 variant in ONA's fleet that could make that journey non-stop with a reasonable passenger load was the company's only DC-9-33, which had just enough extra range to meet the legal requirements. So, said and done, ONA and ALM agreed to initiate this service using that aircraft under a contract known as a damp lease, where ONA would provide the aircraft and the flight crew, while ALM provided the cabin crew and handled ticket sales. But there were quite some problems with this arrangement from the very start. A major one was that a straight-line flight between New York and St. Martin couldn't legally be flown by a 2-engine aircraft because the extended twin-engine operations, or ETOPS rules that we have today, didn't exist yet. Instead, back in 1970, aircraft with 2 engines had to remain within 1 hour single-engine flying time from a suitable airport in case of an engine failure, and on this route there was a very short stretch where the nearest airport was slightly more than 1 hour away. As a result, the FAA initially decided not to approve the proposed flights, which was a big problem for both ONA and LM, since they had already started advertising the service. The FAA proposed that the flights should be routed via the Bahamas to stay closer to land, but this would also make the trip much longer, forcing the flights to stop for fuel along the way. And if they did that, ONA would lose money on the flights, and they were already losing money overall, so that was a non-starter for them. But just days before the flights were supposed to start, McDonnell Douglas came to ONA's rescue by publishing a new single-engine descent procedure that extended the 1 hour range just enough to cover the gap in the original proposed routing. This meant that the FAA finally approved these non-stop flights, but that didn't solve all of the problems. You see, the DC-933 only had enough range to make that trip non-stop if conditions were perfect. So if there were any en route delays due to weather or traffic, the contract stipulated that the flights could do a fuel stop on the island of Bermuda. So the plan became to then fly from New York generally towards Bermuda. Then before crossing the island, the pilots would evaluate whether they could reach St. Martin with the required fuel margin. And if they could, well, then they could just proceed directly towards the destination without a fuel stop. This was a little bit convoluted, but by some miracle, the New York to St. Martin route began as scheduled in January of 1970, but it didn't take long before the FAA threatened to ground the flights again, this time due to a dispute over the seating in the DC-9's cockpit. You see, back in the early days of transoceanic flights, navigators were employed to calculate the aircraft's course while out of range of ground-based navigational aids over the ocean. And by 1970, navigators were rapidly becoming obsolete. But ONA still had a contract with the Navigators Union lasting until 1971. And under that contract, any flight that would fly out of range of ground-based navigational aids had to have a navigator on board. And a very brief stretch of this route met those criteria, so ONA was obliged to supply a qualified navigator. Now, ONA had already arranged for the pilots to traverse that small gap using brand new Loran C long-range navigational equipment, so there was actually nothing for that navigator to do, but still, they had to be there. The DC-9 was obviously designed to only have a cockpit crew of 2. Not 3, so the navigator had to sit in the tiny, uncomfortable jump seat for the 3.5-hour flight down and then back up again from St. Martin. And shortly after the service began, the FAA sent an inspector to ride along on one of the flights for a routine operations check. But because the jump seat wasn't available, the pilots told the inspector to now sit in the cabin instead, which was obviously not acceptable to the FAA, since the whole point was to monitor the procedures used by the flight crew. As a result, the FAA threatened to ground the flights immediately, which then forced ONA to quickly hash out an agreement with the Navigators Union, allowing the FAA inspectors to occupy the jump seat upon request. This sounds almost comical now, but it presented real problems for ONA, and as we will soon see, it would not be the last issue they would have with the FAA over this particular route. So by this point, it's pretty clear that ONA was on thin ice with the FAA for multiple reasons, and another reason was added in April of 1970 when a flight to St. Martin had landed with less than the minimum required fuel remaining, while an FAA inspector was on board. And to understand why that is so significant for this story, we need to talk about how the required fuel was normally calculated. Every flight was required to take off, not only with enough fuel to taxi to the runway and to fly to the destination, but also enough to make a missed approach, to fly to the furthest designated alternate airport, then hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet, that's something known as the final reserve, and then land with an additional reserve equal to 10% of the en route trip fuel, known as the contingency fuel. So the idea was that the flights should land at the destination with at least the 30 minutes holding plus alternate airport fuel still in the tanks. If while en route the flight crew calculated that they would likely land with less fuel than that, well then they should consider diverting to an alternate airport preemptively, unless a successful landing at a destination could be virtually guaranteed. During that April 1970 incident, a flight landed in St. Martin with only 3,400 pounds of fuel remaining, which was much less than the final reserve plus alternate airport fuel. The inspectors investigated the planning of the flight, eventually prompting the FAA to impose new minimum fuel requirements specifically for ONA's New York to St. Martin service. In its bulletin, the FAA stipulated that the expected fuel on arrival for these flights must not be less than 7,000 pounds, and that bulletin that they created was then distributed to all ONA staff on May 1st, 1970, just one day before the events of this story. So on the 2nd of May, an ONA flight crew then arrived at New York's JFK International Airport to operate the flight down towards St. Martin. In command was a 37-year-old captain with 12,000 flying hours, including 1,700 on the DC-9, and he had a pretty wild personal background. He and the CEO of ONA were old Air Force buddies, and in 1967 the CEO had approached his captain with an offer to become ONA's chief pilot for the DC-9 fleet, which he also accepted. He described himself as a traditional stick and rudder aviator who didn't like using the autopilot much because he thought it would make him lazy. And he was also known for being hard on trainees, something he was so proud of that he repeatedly went around referring to himself as a cherub-faced assassin. But just 4 months after being appointed as the DC-9 chief pilot, he had then taken several trainee police officers on a joyride while the aircraft was out for flight training. And around that same time, a cadet who the captain had evaluated unfavorably accused him of allowing a random girl to sit in the co-pilot's seat during a flight. As a result of those accusations, he was forced to resign from his chief pilot role, although he still continued to work as an instructor. Later, he would be assigned a trainee that would turn out to be the first officer of the flight that we're soon about to cover, and the captain had felt during his training that this first officer's skills were too weak to pass a check ride. But he had still sent the first officer to another instructor for a second opinion, and that instructor ended up passing him, but ONA still decided to fire him anyway. The first officer had then appealed on the grounds that his probationary period had ended with his approved check ride, so he was not subject to discretionary termination, and that actually worked, which caused him to be reinstated again. It has to be said, though, that this first officer was not a very confident individual. At the time of this flight, he had about 3,500 hours in total, including 600 on the DC-9, but he had emerged from his training ordeal so shaken that he had actually requested to spend some time as an observer before starting regular line flights, which is not something that I've ever heard about before. Now, for some reason, the airline actually granted this, but at the end of April, he was told that he had been rostered as a first officer on the May 2nd flight over towards St. Martin. The first officer objected to this, arguing that he had never flown internationally before, hadn't been trained on the St. Martin procedures, and had no experience with the Loran C navigational system. But it is equally likely that he just didn't want to fly with the captain who had previously been so hard on him. In any case, his protests didn't work, and he therefore showed up at JFK Airport that morning alongside the captain and the navigator. Now, the navigator was fairly experienced, but had not been given any specific DC-9 training, and as I mentioned before, he had no formal duties on this flight except to fulfill the contractual obligation of just being there. In addition to these 3 flight crew, there were also 3 flight attendants, consisting of a purser and a stewardess in the front, plus a steward in the back. And all 3 cabin crew were ALM employees from the islands of Aruba and Curaçao, and all 3 had undergone training on the differences in the emergency equipment between ONA's and ALM's DC-9s, but back in those days there was no crew resource management training for flight crew to cabin crew communication, so they hadn't practiced ONA's emergency coordination procedures, which is worth remembering. Anyway, in addition to the 6 flight crew, 57 passengers also soon boarded the flight, for a total of 63 people on board. And as the passengers boarded, the flight crew set about calculating the fuel that they would require to make this flight. The captain had just picked up that new fuel requirement bulletin from his mailbox earlier in that morning and had read it shortly before the flight. In addition to the new FAA-imposed minimum arrival fuel of 7,000 pounds, the bulletin also incorporated the results of a Douglas fuel burn study that imposed a further 10% increase in the calculated en route fuel burn. That increase came from the fact that ONA had fitted its DC-9s with jet-assisted takeoff, or J2 rockets, to increase the allowable payload weights when hauling cargo out of hot and high airports. The fittings for these rockets caused extra drag, resulting in up to 10% more fuel burn than Douglas fuel burn tables anticipated. And since the accident aircraft was a DC-9-33CF, CF meaning convertible freighter, it had the J2 rocket fittings on it. Now, taking that penalty into account, the captain arrived at a figure of 21,000 pounds for fuel for the taxi takeoff and then flight to St. Martin and the landing. And they then added another 2,100 pounds for the 10% contingency fuel, plus 2,100 pounds to divert to the designated alternate in St. Thomas, as well as 2,200 pounds as the final reserve, for a total of 6,400 pounds of reserve fuel. He then rounded this number up to the new minimum of 7,000 and added that to the trip fuel for a total required fuel of 28,000 pounds. Since the takeoff weight wasn't an issue here, he asked the fuelers to fill the tanks completely, which resulted in a final fuel quantity of 28,900 pounds. Now, in my view, that was a perfectly adequate quantity to take, and it's unlikely that most pilots would have decided to take much more than this unless they expected to encounter delays or quite bad weather at the destination. In this case, the pilots had been provided with an AirMet weather bulletin describing scattered to locally numerous showers and thunderstorms with cloud ceilings below 1,000 feet and visibility less than 2 miles in localized areas across Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands and the northern Leeward Islands, including St. Martin. This was only a little bit worse than typical spring weather in the Caribbean, so the captain probably didn't see this as a huge issue, especially since the poor conditions were supposed to be quite localized. This meant that once the fueling was decided on and completed, the pilots just went ahead and finished up the pre-flight preparations, planning for just a normal departure. The technical log was free of faults, but the pilots did notice that the cockpit microphone for the public address, the PA system, wasn't working. At the time, the PA system wasn't a required item, so the pilots just wrote it up in the tech log and carried on with the expectation that this would be fixed at a later point. But this would soon come to have some quite severe consequences. Finally, after loading all the passengers and bags, the aircraft pushed back from the gate at time 11:02, operating as ALM Antillean Airlines Flight 980, with the captain acting as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. They taxied out to the runway as normal and soon executed a standard takeoff, climbing away into the crisp spring air over New York City. Now, in his fuel calculations, the captain had assumed a cruise altitude of 29,000 feet, as well as a speed of Mach 0.78 for the first half of the flight. That was then followed by long-range cruise configuration for the second half, which is just a setting that balances speed and fuel consumption to achieve the optimal range. This is significant because jet aircraft are more efficient at higher altitudes, leading to less fuel burn, and in fact the efficiency gain is so large that it substantially outweighs the extra fuel required to get up there in the first place, which is why jet pilots try to climb as high as possible, even on quite short flights. Anyway, as Flight 980 now proceeded southeast across the Atlantic Ocean, the pilots initially adhered to their flight plan and nothing unusual was noted at all. The fuel burn rate was in line with their calculations, so at the decision point abeam Bermuda, the crew decided to maintain a direct course towards St. Martin without stopping for more fuel. But over the next couple of hours, the assumptions in the flight plan soon started to vary a little bit. Thunderstorms were building up along their route, and the pilots were therefore forced to make weather deviations as they progressed southwards. And they also experienced some light turbulence, so the captain eventually descended from flight level 290 down to 270 and also decelerated to Mach 0.74 in search for smoother air. A little while later, they descended further to flight level 250 and decelerated to Mach 0.72, also in an attempt to reduce turbulence, although I don't really see why decelerating below the turbulence penetration speed would have been of any use. In any case, these deviations caused the plane to burn more fuel than expected and also to set their estimated time of arrival back from 1442 to 1500. The captain estimated that they would land with 6,000 pounds of fuel remaining, having used up almost all of the 2,100 pounds of continuous fuel. But then of course, stuff like this is what that en route continuous fuel is actually for. Anyway, soon after crossing the Guava intersection, 211 miles north of St. Martin, Flight 980 made contact with the Regional Air Traffic Control Center in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which authorized them to descend down to 10,000 feet. But San Juan also reported that the latest weather observation from Princess Juliana International Airport was now below the approach minimums. You see, because the runway at the airport extended into the water on both ends, there were no place to install an instrument landing system, ILS, and it still actually doesn't have one today. Of course, these days aircraft can fly instrument approaches using GPS instead, but in 1970 the only available instrument procedure was a quite difficult non-precision approach. This was based off a non-directional beacon, or NDB, located 600 meters south of the threshold for runway 09, and the procedure called for the crew to first initiate themselves over the NDB, then roll out on an outbound heading of 285 degrees before performing a left-hand course reversal onto an inbound heading of 105 degrees back towards the NDB, whilst also descending down to the minimum descent altitude of 600 feet. Now, if the runway could then be seen at or before the missed approach point, the pilots would have to visually align with the runway, which was slightly off to their left, meaning that the approach was also offset from the runway centerline. Because of this, the approach required a cloud base, no lower than 600 feet obviously, and at least 2 miles of visibility. When the captain of Flight 980 heard that the weather was below those minimums, he immediately concluded that the approach could not be completed, and he elected to divert the flight to San Juan in order to wait for the weather to improve. So after establishing the aircraft on a westerly heading away from St. Martin, he then called up Princess Juliana Tower via HF radio in order to learn more about the weather situation and verify just how bad it actually was. Now, the tower replied that they had previously told San Juan that the conditions were below minimums, but that conditions had now improved slightly, with a broken cloud base at 1,000 feet and 4 to 5 miles visibility in continuous rain. It took several attempts for the crew to understand this report of the unstable and almost broken HF connection, but when they finally did, the captain concluded that the weather was now improving and that a landing attempt could therefore be made. So he switched over to San Juan Control and asked for clearance back towards St. Martin, which was also granted. Now here I want to pause a little bit and talk about strategic decision making. At this point, the captain had to weigh in several different factors, including the already higher than expected fuel burn, the fact that they had now been flying away from St. Martin for several minutes, burning even more fuel, and that the Princess Juliana Tower was still reporting continuous rain. On the other hand, the forecast had mentioned only localized areas of low visibility, so he would have likely felt that the chances of a successful landing were pretty high if the storm was now already moving away from the field. So the question would then be whether it was safe to fly back to St. Martin, potentially make a missed approach, and then after that fly to their designated alternate, which was located on St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands. By this point, they only had 5,800 pounds of fuel left, whereas the diversion to St. Thomas would require about 2,100. And the captain knew that he should ideally land at the destination with not less than 4,300 pounds remaining, that is, the diversion fuel plus the final reserve. If he was projected to land with less than that, he should strongly consider to just divert immediately instead of trying at the destination. But remember that flight back in April, the one that had landed in St. Martin with less than minimum fuel remaining, prompting that FAA investigation? Well, it turns out that the captain of this flight was the same captain who had flown back then as well. And to make matters even worse, neither the inexperienced and uncertain first officer nor the navigator was in a position to challenge his decision-making given the massive experience and seniority gap, and also because the navigator wasn't even in the cockpit at this point. So it maybe doesn't come as a huge surprise that the captain decided that he could make it, and more importantly, that no one questioned his decision. The captain figured that if the approach was successful, they should be on the ground by time 15:05 with 4,400 pounds of fuel remaining, which would then be just over the legal minimum. But that prediction assumed that they would be given the most direct route to the approach fix. And in reality, Flight 980 ended up being given delaying vectors instead due to some traffic in the area. And most of those vectors were then flown at an altitude of just 2,500 feet, causing them to burn 800 pounds more fuel than the captain had previously predicted. In fact, the flight didn't even receive its approach clearance until time 15:15. 10 minutes after the captain had calculated that they should be on the ground. And at this point, an immediate diversion to St. Thomas should probably have been made, since it was now evident that they would land with below minimum diversion fuel. In a situation like that, you should only commit to your destination if the weather clearly will allow you to land. And if they would attempt this approach but then fail to land, well, then they would only barely have enough fuel to reach St. Thomas, and no pilot wants to put themselves in that kind of situation. In fact, just thinking about it makes the hair stand up on my arm. But this captain still continued, and the reason was probably that classic affliction that we call get-there-itis. You see, from the captain's perspective, the conditions were above minimums and a landing seemed likely, in which case they would get to their destination and everyone would be happy. Sure, if they did have to make a missed approach and divert, it would be an uncomfortable close shave, but that likely wouldn't happen. And if he landed at the destination, it would be less complicated and also save a lot of fuel. That is exactly how get-there-itis get a hold of you and tricks you into a tunnel of bad decision making. And we pilots are today taught to avoid this by using threat and error management techniques, which includes anticipating potential threats like an increase in fuel burn and establishing clear decision-making gates, such as minimum fuel levels at which point that we have to divert, as well as an agreed-upon maximum number of approaches. This is something that me and my friend Ben talk a lot about in our podcast, Captain Speaking, which I hope that you've already checked out. If not, there's a link to it up here. Now, another really important factor is the role of the pilot monitoring here, who should always be acting as the voice of reason, pulling the captain out of his get-there-itis. But the first officer in this case didn't seem to have said much at all, and there was no real threat analysis made by any of them. Now, it should also be said that what the pilots also didn't know was that the weather report from Princess Juliana Airport didn't actually reflect the real conditions out on the approach path. The latest report gave a cloud base of broken clouds at 1,000 feet with 2 to 3 miles of visibility. But this reading was actually taken with reference to the hills east of the airport, whereas the approach was from the west. Because there were no features southwest of the airport, only open water, controllers couldn't accurately judge the visibility in that direction. But people who were in that area at the time of this approach reported that a rain shower was parked at a short distance off the approach end of runway 09, and the local visibility in that area was possibly as low as 1/2 to 1/4 of a mile. Still unaware of this fact, the pilot soon overflew the NDB and started heading outbound while descending to 600 feet according to the procedure. They continuously configured the aircraft, soon selecting flaps 25, lowering the landing gear and slowing the aircraft down to 140 knots. The captain then executed the inbound turn towards the general direction of the runway, but when they popped out of the rain and caught sight of the airport, he realized that they had overshot the center line and that the runway was now too far off to their left in order to align visually. At this point, they had about 3,800 pounds of fuel left, which was still technically enough to carry them through the missed approach and fly to St. Thomas with a little bit of fuel left to spare. But instead of taking the decision to just divert, the flight crew now didn't even discuss that possibility. Instead, the captain felt that he could have made the approach if only he had kept the runway in sight during the base turn. So he decided to maintain 600 feet in the same configuration and make a tight left-hand circle northwest of the runway. The idea was that by staying close, he could maintain visual contact with the runway, but obviously this was not what the approach procedure said that he should be doing. He technically had clearance to do this because the controller had granted him permission to do whatever maneuvers that he deemed necessary. But for the record, we would definitely not be allowed to do this today, both because it wasn't a properly briefed beforehand maneuver and because the probability of success would have been pretty low. Anyway, the captain now executed that tight circling maneuver, but he still wasn't able to keep his airplane out of the rain shower on the approach end, and as a result of this, he again lost sight of the airport, and for the second time in a row, he rolled out too late with the runway too far to his left. Now these days, most airlines don't even allow us to make 3 approaches to the same airport unless the third approach is practically guaranteed to succeed, but that rule was only implemented because of stories like this one. The captain now therefore decided to make a third approach attempt, only this time his plan was to circle with the flaps fully extended at an airspeed of just 130 knots in an attempt to keep the turning radius even tighter. Now flying through a second, level, left-hand turn in the full landing configuration would obviously result in a very high fuel burn due to the large amount of drag, but that was never really discussed. In fact, the first officer seems to have been little more than a passenger at this point, and there was no record of what the navigator thought. So the captain simply executed his turn without any protests from his fellow crew members, and this time he was actually able to keep the runway in sight throughout the maneuver. But because he had executed this turn so close to the threshold, there now wasn't enough distance remaining to safely descend from 600 feet down to the runway in a stabilized way. The captain initially tried anyway, but very quickly gave up after realizing that the steep descent would balloon their speed to the point where they likely would probably overrun the runway if he tried to land. So he now finally executed a missed approach after having made 3 failed landing attempts within the space of just 11 minutes. Calculations showed that they should have had around 2,200 pounds of fuel remaining at this point, which was just barely over the 2,100 theoretically required to reach St. Thomas, but that figure assumed that the crew would climb as high as practical using the optimal power settings, and any unexpected variables could cause the actual fuel consumption to be much higher, which is of course why we're not supposed to push things this far in the first place. So they were now in a full-blown fuel emergency, but that was never officially called out. Instead, immediately after abandoning the third approach, the captain called Juliana Tower to request a diversion, and the tower just cleared them to fly directly towards St. Thomas at 4,000 feet. Moments later, at time 15:31, Flight 980 was then handed over to the San Juan Area Control Center, where they were told that a higher altitude would be assigned to them shortly. In the meantime, the pilots glanced at the fuel gauges and observed that they were reading erratically, displaying values anywhere between 850 to over 2,000 pounds. Now, these strange readings could have been due to condensation on the fuel quantity probes, in addition to the sloshing motion of the little fuel that was remaining in the tanks, but in any case, the captain was certain that they couldn't have had less than 2,000 pounds left in the tanks, which calculations later showed was correct, and the first officer's maths that he was doing also confirmed this. The problem was though that this still wouldn't be enough unless they could get as high as possible as quickly as possible. And just before 15:33, the San Juan controller asked Flight 980 what altitude they would like, and the captain replied, "Anything you've got higher." About a minute later, the controller cleared them to climb to 12,000 feet, and the captain immediately complied, but curiously, he used a lower power setting than he should have, apparently in order to save fuel. Which is actually the opposite of what you should do in this situation. You see, you need as much thrust as possible, because the fuel saved by getting to a higher altitude faster is more than the fuel saved by using low engine power settings. Which is of course something that he as an instructor should have been well aware of. But it is likely that he was now starting to panic slightly. It is also worth noting that the pilots would have been well within their right to declare a fuel emergency here, and actually they were in that situation even earlier, as soon as they realized that they would infringe on the final reserve. But back then, the criteria for declaring a fuel emergency weren't as clear-cut as they are today. Basically, it was left up to the captain's discretion. Anyway, after the captain initiated the climb, the first officer asked San Juan how far they were from St. Thomas, to which the controller replied that they were 92 miles southeast of the field. But the captain could tell at a glance that the San Croix, another of the Virgin Islands located south of St. Thomas, would be closer. So he now called up the controllers and asked for the distance to there instead. The San Juan controller replied that they were 70 miles northeast of San Croix, and the weather there was overcast at 2,000 feet with 15 miles visibility, which meant that the captain now immediately decided to change course for that island instead. He instructed the first officer to find the approach chart for San Croix, but they had been misfiled in the booklet of Jeppesen charts, so he couldn't locate them. And by this time, the inexperienced first officer was likely in a state of what we today would call subtle incapacitation. So his reaction to this escalating situation was basically just to freeze. This meant that the captain had to call for him multiple times in order to get any reaction back, and that also triggered the captain to take over more and more of the radio calls until he was basically doing everything himself, flying the plane, talking to air traffic control, and trying to strategize. With today's crew resource management training, we're taught how to prevent this kind of uneven task distribution from arising, but these guys, remember, had not yet gotten that type of training. Now at this point, even if they had distributed the task effectively, it didn't really matter much. Because of the captain's inefficient climb, they had now burned enough fuel to place both St. Thomas and St. Croix outside of their reach. And in fact, the only airport that was now still in range was St. Martin itself, where they had just failed to land 3 times. To their horror, as they were climbing through 7,000 feet, they now saw the fuel gauges indicating only 550 pounds of fuel left. And seconds later, the yellow low fuel pressure lights came on, warning the crew that the engines were now on the verge of flame out due to fuel starvation. And it was at that moment that they realized that unless some miracle occurred, they were going to run out of fuel somewhere over the storm-tossed Caribbean Sea. Now, as soon as that reality hit, the pilot called the purser up to the cockpit and informed him that they were now low on fuel and might have to ditch the aircraft. But the captain's use of the word might led the purser to believe that the warning was just precautionary and that they would receive some follow-up if a ditching would actually become necessary. Now this, by the way, is why modern CRM training also includes pilot to cabin crew coordination and communication techniques, because you really don't want these type of misunderstandings to occur. As a result, the purser now informed the passengers that they would be preparing for a possible ditching, but he didn't know if or how much time they would have until that ditching would occur. Without that knowledge, the purser made the wise decision that the most important step should be taken first, which was to get all of the passengers into their life vests. So the crew now quickly began life vest demonstrations, but the process of donning the vests proved to be much more complicated than they expected. Many passengers had trouble getting the vests out of the pouches from the underside of their seats, and some couldn't open the plastic coverings, whilst others were confused about how to tighten the waist straps. There were also 2 different types of life vests on board, which used slightly different donning procedures, and that clearly didn't help. To make matters even worse, some passengers assumed that ditching was very unlikely since the preparations had been described as precautionary, so they took no action at all, and a few of them even got out of their seats and started wandering around in the cabin taking pictures instead of getting themselves ready. Meanwhile, the navigator tried to help the purser to reposition the forward life raft, but it was so heavy that they needed help from a passenger to get it out of its dedicated closet. Up in the cockpit, the captain was now faced with an even more difficult tactical decision. You see, a ditching on the ocean has to be done very carefully. The wise approach is to identify the direction of the swells and to land parallel to the crest so as not to crash head-on into a wave, which could cause the aircraft to break apart. And it's also best in any ditching to try to touch down with as little forward speed and vertical speed as possible. But if they climbed as high as they could before the fuel ran out and then glided down without engines in an attempt to get closer to land, well, then they would have to glide through the dense overcast clouds with only the tiny standby instruments to help them. And to make matters even worse, they would then have only seconds to identify the direction of the swells under the clouds, maneuver and then slow the aircraft down for touchdown, all without engine power. In the captain's mind, this would be close to impossible, so he instead decided to break off their climb and immediately descend down towards the water so that he would have more time to assess the conditions and slow the aircraft before the fuel ran out. And it should be said here that having engine thrust available is also a prerequisite in modern ditching checklists, so the captain probably was right in doing this. At time 1538, the captain told the San Juan controller that he would like to descend, which was immediately granted. He then called the St. Martin Tower to ask for the latest weather there, just in case, but he was told that the visibility was now 2 to 3 miles and deteriorating, even worse than what they had had during their failed landing attempts. So, ruling out St. Martin, he switched back to San Juan's frequency and told the controller that he was descending down to the water and might need to ditch in the sea. The center supervisor immediately reacted to this, notifying the Coast Guard, who began dispatching ships and helicopters to respond to the now evolving emergency. The San Juan controller then again suggested that they should go back towards St. Martin, which was theoretically still in range, but on account of the bad weather there, the captain rejected this idea. With only a couple of minutes of fuel remaining, Flight 980 broke through the overcast clouds about 500 feet above the water, and what the pilots then saw was probably downright terrifying. The sea below them was nothing like the Caribbean that we see in travel adverts. Instead, it was dark and angry, with huge foaming waves rolling in from all different directions. No one had ever ditched a passenger jet under conditions like that, and basically no one has done that since either, but this flight crew now had no choice but to try. With the engines running on fumes, the captain started lowering the aircraft towards the waves from 500 feet by descending carefully in 100 feet increments. Every 100 feet he then leveled off to let his depth perception adjust and lower the speed just enough to select the next level of flaps. He wanted to land with full flaps because that would allow him to fly as slowly as possible without stalling, which should minimize the damage and injuries. The captain also closed the rear cabin outflow valve to prevent water from coming in that way, which was part of the ditching checklist, although they would end up not getting much further than this on that checklist. Now, realizing that he didn't know how much time they had left in the air, the navigator now returned to the cockpit and asked the captain, who just said that he would give a heads up at least a few seconds before impact. While the first officer shut off the air conditioning packs, the captain then set flaps full, and the plane then rapidly decelerated from 140 down to just 90 knots, which was very close to its stall speed. And as he did so, at time 15:47 and 40 seconds, he called San Juan Control and said, 980, Roger, we're ditching. And that will be the last transmission from the aircraft. Moments later, it also disappeared from radar as it descended to just 20 feet above the water. The captain now turned on the emergency power switch to ensure that his instruments would continue to receive power from the emergency bus after both engines flamed out. And at around that same time, he also tried to alert the cabin crew to prepare for impact. But remember that the public address system was inoperative? Yeah, realizing this, he then instead flashed the fasten seatbelt light 3 times in a row, which he believed would be interpreted as an emergency signal. But the ALM flight attendants had no such conception at all, and even if they did, nobody in the cabin could remember seeing or hearing the lights flashing or any chime being heard. Now, the exact order of these events isn't exactly known, but if the captain flashed the seatbelt sign after flipping the emergency power switch, well then the lights would not have come on anyway. In any case, the result of this was that nobody in the cabin understood that impact was imminent, and just a few moments later, the first of the engines flamed out, followed quickly by the second one. The captain shouted at the navigator to "Get ready!" through the open cockpit door, and that was the first and only warning anyone in the cabin would get about the imminent impact. Now, the navigator immediately shouted for the purser and steward to sit down, but none of them had time to fasten their seatbelts, and the steward didn't even have time to get back to a chair, so he just sat down on top of the uninflated life raft in the galley instead. Further back in the cabin, a passenger shouted that they were about to crash, alerting the stewardess, who was helping some elderly passengers with their life vests. And instead of her sitting down, she immediately now started moving backwards through the plane, pushing people down into their seats in a desperate attempt to get the cabin ready. But sadly, she didn't make it further than row 4. In the cockpit, the captain now aimed for the backside of a swell in order to soften the impact, and he then shouted for the first officer to brace. A split second later, Flight 980 smashed into the surface of the Caribbean Sea with a tremendous force, estimated to be around 8 to 12 Gs, and the DC-9 then decelerated so sharply that it's thought to have come to a stop within a distance shorter than its own length. In a split second, the pilots found themselves completely submerged with a nose-down attitude at nearly 45 degrees of left bank, and for a split second it seemed like they were traveling through the water like a submarine. The captain instinctively rolled the wings level, which actually worked because the flight controls doesn't really care if they're submerged in water or air, it's all fluid dynamics. As the wings leveled, the cockpit resurfaced and the DC-9 started floating, pitching and rolling in the heavy seas, mostly in one piece. But back in the cabin, the damage was severe. Several people had been standing at the time of the crash, including stewardess Margaret Abraham, who was likely thrown to her death as she selflessly rushed to save her passengers. Most or all of those who were standing during the impact were likely killed instantly. But a number of sitting passengers also suffered serious or even fatal injuries after their seats were ripped out of the floor and flung violently forward. 7 passengers were also found to have been ejected from their seats due to failures of the DC-9's antiquated fabric-to-metal type seatbelt buckles, which relied on a claw grip to prevent the buckle from coming undone. Now, the exact number of people who perished during the immediate impact is unknown, but for those who had survived, this ordeal was now far from over. You see, Flight 980 was now floating on the sea, 35 miles from the nearest land, with rescuers still over 90 minutes away, and the DC-9 soon started to sink. As soon as the airplane had come to a stop, water started pouring in through every hole and crack, so the surviving flight attendants and the navigator immediately tried to deploy the life raft. But the galley where the raft was located was soon full of rushing water, spilled equipment and even a passenger who had been thrown forward from the cabin. Amid this chaos, someone accidentally pulled on the raft's inflation lanyard, causing it to inflate inside of the galley, cutting off all of the remaining crew members from the passenger cabin. Now behind them, a passenger had managed to open the aft right overwing exit, so people were starting to evacuate onto the wing, only to discover that the waves were crashing down over it, and their only choice was therefore to jump into the cold water. The captain became trapped in the cockpit due to the inflated raft in the galley, so he exited via the left cockpit window and then swam back to the left wing, somehow managed to climb up and open an overwing exit from the outside, helping 2 passengers to escape that way. At the right forward passenger door, the inflating raft had pushed the navigator out of the open doorway into the sea, where he soon found the uninflated slide pack floating on the water, so he just inflated that instead, and passengers who saw it and swam towards it, clinging to the sides, using it as a makeshift raft. The first officer had initially been squeezed between the inflated raft and the galley wall, but then he managed to escape and soon jumped into the water towards the inflated slide, only to realize that he had forgotten to put his own life vest on. So he instead climbed up on top of the slide and began taking command of that vessel to help all of the passengers who were gathered there. By the time the last passenger had left the plane, the DC-9 was now sinking very quickly, and the water inside had soon completely covered the tops of the exit doors. Moments later, the survivors watched as the plane slowly pitched forward and finally slid nose first beneath the waves, never to be seen again. The passengers and crew of ALM Flight 980 were now floating alone in the ocean, surrounded by broken pieces of the airplane and its cargo, spilled oil and other debris. Waves measuring 3 to 4 meters in height tossed them about beneath a dark, overcast sky and curtains of falling rain, but then, out of the storm, a massive, roaring shape emerged. Not a ship, but a Pan Am Boeing 727 who had been diverted from its course to look for the missing plane. The 727 crew managed to catch a glimpse of the wreckage and the survivors and soon radioed San Juan with the coordinates, which were then passed on to the numerous vessels and aircraft that were already en route. A US Coast Guard flying boat managed to reach the scene soon after that, along with a short Skyvan operated by a flight school over on San Juan. And Both flight crews tried to drop life rafts for the survivors, but they were unfortunately blown too far downwind, landing more than 30 meters away from the nearest people in the water. Now, the captain and navigator both swam to the rafts, but they were then unable to propel them back towards the other survivors, leaving them stranded. The passengers and crew ultimately held out for a terrifying 90 minutes before a US Navy Sea King helicopter finally arrived and began pulling people out of the water. The Navy crew ended up rescuing no less than 26 people, including the captain, all without having any trained rescue swimmers on board, which is just incredible. A US Coast Guard helicopter also arrived soon after and tried to retrieve several people using a rescue basket, but the winch broke after rescuing only 4 people, including the navigator and the purser, and the helicopter crew then tried to rescue people directly from the water by hauling them manually up onto the skids. But they were soon forced to give up that attempt and return to base because the waves were taller than the helicopter, making the rescue attempt just far too dangerous. A second Coast Guard helicopter then moved in and picked up 7 more people, which was the most that it could carry, but that still left 3 people clinging to the escape slide, including the first officer, as darkness was now falling. At around 1800, 2 US Marine Corps helicopters reached the scene, one of which picked up a deceased passenger and then left, whilst the second stayed just long enough to pull the last 3 survivors aboard before hurrying back to St. Croix, where it reportedly landed with only 5 minutes of fuel remaining. All told, the heroic rescue effort pulled 40 survivors from the water, but unfortunately, a total of 23 people were lost to the sea, including 22 passengers and the stewardess Margaret Abraham, who was posthumously recognized by the Dutch government for her bravery. Of the 23 victims, only 1 was ever found. The rest most likely went down with the plane, which sank to a depth of more than 5,000 feet and was never located or retrieved. Because the National Transportation Safety Board was able to reconstruct the flight using the testimony of the many survivors, they decided not to attempt a recovery of the black boxes, which would have been very difficult with the technology that they had available at the time. So based on these first-hand accounts and other evidence, investigators concluded that the probable cause of this crash was the decision to keep making unsuccessful landing attempts in St. Martin until insufficient fuel remained to reach an alternate airport. The weather conditions in St. Martin, which were worse than reported to the crew, were listed as a contributing factor, and the NTSB also wrote that more people might have survived the accident if there would have been better coordination between the flight and the cabin crew prior to the ditching. As a result of this accident, new rules were introduced to ensure that no airliner could depart with an inoperative public address system unless alternate means of communication was clearly established. And the FAA also mandated the replacement of those fabric-to-metal seatbelts with modern metal-to-metal buckles. But I think that the real lesson of this story is that we must always plan for the worst-case scenario, especially when it comes to fuel planning, and to try keeping our minds constantly ahead of the aircraft using cautious decision-making and crew coordination. In this accident, the captain made a series of decisions based on optimistic assumptions about the situation, only to be let down by reality over and over again. Modern training helps prevent us from slipping into that kind of narrow ostrich-like thinking, but back then all the captain had was his experience and stick and rudder skills, which actually earned him some praise in the NTSB report, although his poor judgment call still lost him his license. And he passed away in 2024 without ever flying another airplane as a pilot again.
I knew I had a couple kids back there, Mila, and I didn't see them after ditching.
How did you know that you had those 2 kids? You saw them get boarding? Yeah.
Yeah. Their father, I think, went down with them.
It took just over 4 minutes for this aircraft to lose control and fall nearly 38,000 feet. That's roughly the same time it takes to toast a piece of bread. What were the crucial details that caused this accident? Stay tuned. The crew who were going to operate Air France Flight 447 arrived in Rio de Janeiro from Paris on the 28th of May 2009. They were scheduled for a 3-day stop in Rio before the return flight back to Paris. We know very little about how they spent their time during this layover, but what is known is that the first officer, who was later going to be pilot flying of this flight, had brought his wife with him for the trip. Given that, it's unlikely that at least he spent the whole day before the flight resting, and there were indications that this might also apply to the other pilots. Flight 447 was scheduled to depart at 8 in the evening Rio time. That would be 11 o'clock at night Paris time, and that meant that the crew would have to operate through the night on the way home, with a scheduled landing time in Paris around midday on the 1st of June. This would mean that the pilots would have to operate throughout the window of circadian law, a time of night during which it's especially hard for the human body and the mind to stay alert. Because of this and the fact that the flight was scheduled to last 12 hours and 45 minutes, the flight crew had been augmented with an extra pilot to allow for scheduled rest during the flight back. This meant that there were 3 pilots who were going to fly together, 1 captain and 2 first officers. The captain was 58 years old and had a total flying experience of 11,000 hours, 1,700 of which was flown as a pilot in command on the Airbus A330. The first officer was 32 years old. He was the least experienced of the crew, with 3,000 hours in total and 800 on the type. He had done his type rating on the Airbus A330 and 340 in 2008, the year before the flight. The third pilot, which I will refer to in this video as the relief pilot, was a 37-year-old first officer. He had a total time of 6,500 hours, but he was actually the most experienced on the type, with 4,500 hours flown on it. He had flown very little during the previous 3 months before the flight because he was also working as a management pilot in Air France. Prior to operating the flight, the pilots met up and reviewed the planning documentation, including weather, flight plans and NOTAMs. The weather was fine for the departure and in Paris, but the en route weather looked a bit more complicated. Since the flight would be crossing the equator, it would also be crossing an area over the Atlantic known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ. In this zone, the easterly trade winds from the northern and southern hemisphere will converge and can force the humid air from the surface of the sea upwards. This can cause powerful thunderstorms that can reach as high as 60,000 feet, which is much higher than most aircraft can fly. This also means that the aircraft who have to fly through this zone might be subject to flying between and sometimes even through part of these storm clouds. The storms, who are formed over water in the ITCZ, can sometimes contain smaller water content than the storms that form over land, making them harder to see on the aircraft's weather radar, so pilots need to be very careful when navigating around them, since they could still be quite severe. The pilots likely discussed this risk of encountering these type of storms and carried a bit of extra fuel to give them the option of navigate around these storms if needed. The pilots also briefed their 9 cabin crew about the possibility of turbulence and the effect that might have on their service. Before we leave the discussion of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, we need to talk a little bit about the types of precipitation that can be found inside of these types of thunderstorms. Most people are familiar with the heavy rain and sometimes hail that typically come out of these clouds, but as you look higher up through the clouds, things can become a bit more complicated. Because of the very strong currents inside of the cloud, water droplets can be forced upwards into very cold air and become supercooled. This means that they are still in water form, but as soon as they hit the surface of some sort, they will instantly freeze and create clear ice. Sometimes these supercooled droplets can collide with snowflakes, and when that happens, a type of soft ice crystals can be formed, which is not as hard as hail, but big enough to be heard when it hits the aircraft if you fly through it. This type of precipitation doesn't create the type of heavy airframe icing that supercold rain does, but it has significant volume and can quickly clog up and overwhelm sensors and probes on the aircraft, especially the pitot probes, which I will explain later. More than 9 different occurrences of this type of clogging happening to Air France flights had been reported during 2008 and 2009, and these reports, together with how to recognize and deal with the issues, had been published in safety bulletins circulated to all Air France pilots during the year before the accident flight. The aircraft that the pilots were going to operate was a reasonably new Airbus A330-203. It had been delivered to Air France in 2005 and was in almost perfect working order on the evening of the departure. Prior to arriving to the aircraft, the pilots ordered 70.4 tons of fuel to be loaded, and together with their cabin crew they walked out to the aircraft and started preparing it for departure. Now, it will be impossible to explain what happened on this flight without also explaining a few details about this Airbus, but also a little bit about flying in general. Pilots need a way to accurately measure the amount of air that is flowing over the wings, because that's what really determines the performance of the aircraft. To do this, they utilize a type of probe known as a pitot tube or a pitot probe. These probes are often situated along the front of the aircraft below the cockpit, and they look a little bit like gun barrels, and they have a hole in the front where the air enters and the total pressure is then measured inside of the tube. They are electrically heated, and the heating is automatic on the Airbus A330. But in order to accurately measure the airspeed, the static pressure must also be measured, so it can be deducted from the total pressure from the pitot probes. This static pressure is measured from a different device called a static port, and that static pressure is then used both for calculating the airspeed and, crucially, also the altitude of the aircraft. These different pressures are then sent to the aircraft computers called Air Data Modules or ADMs. The ADMs will calculate the correct true airspeed, but another thing that will become hugely important in this story is that the static pressure from the static port must be corrected depending on how fast the aircraft is flying. That's because the air flows over the aircraft surfaces surrounding the static port and will therefore create localized pressure differences depending on the speed. These corrections are done automatically by the ADM computers, and because airspeed and altitude are critical values, there are 3 different independent sets of probes and computers fitted to the aircraft. Now, because of the problems that Air France and other operators had reported of ice crystals clogging up the pitot probes, Airbus had started to look into the problem. A newer type of pitot probe had been found to be more effective in preventing these problems, and a maintenance bulletin had been issued suggesting an upgrade to these newer probes. Air France had just started upgrading their first Airbus A330 about 1 month prior to the departure of Flight 447, and the accident aircraft was actually scheduled to have its probes changed on its arrival to Paris after the flight. But why was the change of these pitot probes just a suggested action? Why wasn't it mandatory? Well, that's because the temporary loss of airspeed due to this issue was both very rare, it only lasted for a maximum of a couple of minutes, and there was a defined procedure which the pilots were supposed to follow in case it happened. In Air France, this procedure was known as IS de tous, but I will refer to it in this story as unreliable airspeed. Because this problem had been reported several times, it had been included in the recurrent training scenario for all Air France crews during 2008 and 2009. The training had included airspeed unreliable exercises, but only at low altitude. That's because that was seen as more safety critical because of the closeness to the terrain, but the performance of the aircraft was also much better than it would be at high altitude. Airspeed unreliable can be very tricky to diagnose because the failure will look different depending on what caused it and how severe it is. During the exercises that Air France crews had practiced, the autopilot did not disconnect and there were no warnings sounding in the cockpit when the failure occurred. Now, the airspeed unreliable procedure included the use of memory items, meaning safety critical items that needed to be done straight away from memory of the pilots. But using them was optional depending on the situation, and that had been interpreted as only needed if the aircraft was close to the ground. Also important for this story is that none of the pilots of Flight 447 had received any recent training on how to deal with an approach to stall and recovery, especially at high altitude. The latest stall training that they had actually received was done during their type rating on the Airbus A320, which they had all done years earlier. And that initial training that they had done was all done at low altitude, in which heavy emphasis was put on the use of thrust to recover the aircraft and power it out of the stall, achieving it with minimum altitude loss. Decreasing the pitch was a secondary action to take. Now, this idea that the engines will have enough power to pull an aircraft out of an extreme high angle of attack is also going to become very important. Once the 216 passengers had finished boarding and the crew were ready, the pilots asked for pushback and started moving away from their gate at time 22:09 UTC, only 9 minutes behind schedule. The first officer was pilot flying, and all 3 pilots were present in the cockpit as they were taxiing out. At time 22:29, the aircraft started rolling down the runway in Rio de Janeiro and performed a completely normal takeoff. They climbed away along their clear departure route, which led them up through a northeasterly course following the coastline of Brazil. At some point after passing 20,000 feet climbing, the relief pilot left the cockpit to start his scheduled rest period, which would last about 3 hours. He went back into the crew rest compartment, which consisted of 2 bunk beds just behind the cockpit, and we don't know exactly when he left the cockpit, because the cockpit voice recordings from the cockpit voice recorder doesn't start until just after midnight UTC time. In any case, the 2 remaining pilots received clearance to climb to their initial cruise altitude of flight level 350, 35,000 feet, and once they were establishing cruise, they were talking to controllers from Brasilia FIR, and then later they switched over to Recife control. And it was Recife control who were going to be the last ones to have radar contact with the flight, because in that control area they were largely still flying over land, but once they passed into the next FIR, Atlántico, they would move away from radar coverage and instead be following oceanic traffic separation procedures. Now, flights over oceanic areas requires special training, procedures and aircraft equipment. Since the curvature of the Earth makes VHF radio communication impossible, aircraft are equipped with something called HF radios. These radios use layers in the ionosphere to bounce the signals off from and can therefore reach much further distances. As the aircraft passed an RNAV point called Untold, the pilots checked in with Atlántico control on one of the 2 HF frequencies that they had been given. The pilots then tried to log into a new system that was being tested at the time in the area called ADS-C. This system would use automatic reports sent by the aircraft itself via satellite to update the position of the aircraft to ATC, thus showing where it was even if they didn't have radar coverage. Another cool thing that this new system could do was that it would immediately send a report if an aircraft deviated from the course or altitude that it had been assigned. But unfortunately, due to a formatting error in the flight plan that had been filed, the pilots were unable to log into this new system, and therefore, as soon as the aircraft left conventional radar coverage, it would not be able to be accurately tracked anymore, something that would come to have grave consequences. The Airbus A330 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and that means that the inputs that the pilots make on their side stick and rudders will be electronically interpreted by a computer and then sent to the hydraulic flight control actuators for execution. This type of controls comes with many benefits. For example, it makes the aircraft substantially lighter, but mainly it allows the aircraft to monitor certain safety parameters and make sure that those parameters aren't exceeded. Parameters like excessive bank and pitch angles are monitored, as well as safeguarding the maximum and minimum speeds, and a whole load of other parameters as well. Now, detractors of the system say that this lets the aircraft have the final word of the pilots, but that's not completely true. Only maneuvers which are really extreme and ultimately dangerous are blocked by the system, but the fly-by-wire system do require that the pilots who operate them really understand how they work and when those protections actually work and don't. This is true for all aircraft, obviously, but it's especially true here. And why is that? Well, in order for these protections to properly work, the computers who monitor them needs to be absolutely sure that they are using correct parameters to start with. If that is not the case, the computers will back off and take away those protections simply because the computers aren't really sure what's going on. These computers receive their inputs from a lot of different sources, like the pitot probes, the static ports, the inertial reference units, angle of attack vanes, and so on. They combine all of this data into 3 air data reference units, who together form the Air Data Inertial Reference System. As long as all 3, or at least 2, of these ADRs agree with each other, the aircraft control computers are happy, and it can continue to operate in what's called normal law. Normal law means that all protections are available and that the aircraft is basically impossible to stall or put into an upset situation. But if 2 or more ADRs start sending strange information, a couple of things will quickly happen. First of all, these inconsistencies might affect the autoflight system, like the autopilot that controls the aircraft, the auto throttle governing the engines, and the flight directors who are showing the pilots how to fly. That's quite logical if you think about it. The aircraft will not try to navigate or control the aircraft if it's not sure about what's going on. It will leave that up to the pilots to figure it out. And following up on that same logic, the aircraft control computers will degrade from normal law into either alternate law 1 or alternate law 2, depending on the severity of the issues. The difference between normal law and alternate law 2, which will soon become relevant in this flight, is that the protections that the aircraft normally have regarding maximum angle of attack or stall protection will no longer be available. This will be shown by the removal of warning indicators like the barber's pole on the primary flight display, as well as yellow crosses where the limitations would normally be shown. The other difference is that the roll control of the aircraft changes. In normal law and alternate law 1, the roll inputs on the side stick will command a specific roll rate from the aircraft. If the pilot inputs a specific roll rate to be kept, the aircraft will give that and gust disturbances will be compensated for. It will basically be very stable and easy to handle. But in alternate law 2, the side stick will give direct commands to the ailerons and spoilers rather than commanding a specific roll rate. This means no bank protections or stability control. This will also make the aircraft more roll sensitive, especially at higher altitudes where there's less aerodynamic damping due to the thinner air. Another major difference between a conventional aircraft and an Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft is the pitch trim system. If you're flying manually in a conventional aircraft, the yoke controls the flight controls directly and the trim has to be done deliberately by the pilots. In an Airbus, the side stick input will ask the control computers for a specific roll rate horizontally and a pitch or a G-loading vertically. When the pilot sets a specific pitch, the elevators will initiate the pitch and the massive horizontal stabilizer will then move automatically to continue maintaining that pitch without any pilot input. This also means that there is no big tactile feedback from the stick if the aircraft is entering into a strange trim position due to low speed, for example, which would be the case on another aircraft like the 737, for example, that I'm flying. In normal law, that's not an issue because the aircraft also guards the aircraft from getting close to an angle of attack high enough to stall it, but that's not the case in alternate law. Now, these differences are really important for any pilots to know about, but even more crucially, they need to understand them and they need to be able to retrieve this knowledge when things are starting to go wrong. As Flight 447 now proceeded along their route, they received a message from their company advising them about reported thunderstorm activity further ahead. The first officer changed the scale on his navigation display and started talking about some build-ups that he could see ahead of them. The pilots then started discussing ways to possibly avoid the turbulence that these clouds would bring, and the first officer indicated that he was quite worried about the storm clouds that he could see now getting closer. At time 01:46, the first officer dimmed the cockpit lights in order to see better outside and confirmed that the aircraft was now entering into a cloud layer. It was pitch black outside with the moon situated behind them, and light turbulence now started rocking the aircraft. The crew discussed if it would be possible to climb higher, as it looked like they were just skimming the tops of the clouds at flight level 350. But when the first officer checked the maximum altitude they could climb to, it was indicated as flight level 370, and they both decided that it wouldn't be a good idea to sit at maximum altitude if the turbulence would get worse. Now, this is probably a good opportunity to discuss another thing that will become important very soon. As an aircraft climbs higher, the air will become thinner and thinner outside. And because of that, depending on the weight of the aircraft as well as the outside temperature and some other factors, the aircraft will be limited from continuing to climb as the engines just won't be able to produce enough excess thrust to do it. This also means that the engines do not have much excess thrust to deal with any non-normals up there, and because of that, we pilots need to be very careful and quite conservative with how the aircraft is operated. The only way that an aircraft can climb higher than its indicated max altitude would be to exchange kinetic energy, their speed, for potential energy, altitude. But doing so would dramatically increase the angle of attack. At higher altitudes, the critical angle of attack, meaning the angle where the aircraft will stall if it's exceeded, is also less due to aerodynamic effects from flying closer to the speed of sound. So in short, the aircraft will stall earlier and will have less available thrust at high altitudes. It will also be more sensitive and harder to hand fly due to less air providing aerodynamic damping. After the aircraft had entered into the clouds, the captain started commenting on the appearance of St. Elmo's fire. This is a sure sign of a building electrical charge close to an aircraft, a further indication that they were getting close to storm clouds. Around this time, the captain pressed a button on the overhead panel, which activated a call bell in the crew bunk behind the cockpit. This was the sign to the relief pilot that it was time for him to return to the cockpit and take over for the captain, so the captain could go back to the bunk and get some rest. The relief pilot knocked on the cockpit wall in response to show that he had heard the bell. Now, the Air France standard operating procedures at the time stipulated that the first officer in the right seat, who was pilot flying, would take on the role of piloting command when the captain left for rest unless something else had been agreed. And in this case, this was exactly what happened, and when the relief pilot arrived to the cockpit at time 01:59, the captain left his chair and listened in to the briefing that the first officer gave to the relief pilot. This briefing included the anticipated turbulence, that they were currently flying in cloud and that they couldn't climb any higher at the moment. The captain didn't leave any specific instructions about how the two first officers should deal with the thunderstorms ahead. Instead, he left the cockpit to start his rest. Now, we can only speculate to why he didn't give more clear instructions. Like I mentioned before, all three pilots were used to this type of weather and had flown this route many times, so it is likely that he found the two first officers more than capable of dealing with it. When the captain left, the Air France procedures meant that the much more senior relief pilot now took on the role of pilot monitoring in the left seat, and the first officer continued as pilot flying and effectively piloting command. The two pilots now started discussing the weather situation up ahead, and the first officer mentioned the intertropical convergence zone. But at this stage, there was no discussion about trying to avoid the cells by changing course. Instead, the first officer asked the relief pilot if he had been able to sleep anything, and the relief pilot said that he'd just dozed off a bit. The relief pilot then asked the first officer if he felt okay. This discussion could be interpreted as the two pilots possibly feeling a bit fatigued at this point. The captain had also made some similar remarks earlier. The relief pilot also left his pilot chair in the aft position and didn't move it forward into the piloting position when he sat down. That would likely have given him a more relaxed position where he could put his feet up, but it wouldn't be ideal if he suddenly needed to fly the aircraft, which he soon would need to do. At time 02:06 and 5 seconds, the first officer contacted the cabin crew to advise them that they would likely encounter some light turbulence soon and to tell them to be careful. It was now around 4 minutes since the captain had left the cockpit, and in another 4 minutes the emergency sequence would begin. The relief pilot now started looking closer at his navigation display, and he reached down and changed the gain on his weather radar to max. This made the weather radar more sensitive and highlighted the weather ahead of them. He then asked the first officer if he maybe wanted to go a bit to the left, indicating some discomfort with what he was seeing in front of them. The first officer asked what he meant, and he then pointed out the return on the screen in front of them and asked again if they could turn left. The first officer agreed and turned the heading bug about 12 degrees to the left. This was a quite small correction given the amount of weather they had in front of them, but it meant that they now left their flight plan route and they didn't try to radio in this change to air traffic control. At time 02:08 and 17 seconds, the cockpit voice recorder picked up a change in the background noise in the cockpit. This noise sounded like rain hitting the cockpit. At the same time, the first officer noticed that the temperature was going up, and he asked if the relief pilot had done something with the air conditioning. He then asked, "What's that smell?" The relief pilot recognized the smell as ozone and calmed his colleague down by explaining what ozone was. These comments, as well as the precipitation heard outside the aircraft, were all signs of the type of weather phenomenon the aircraft was now flying into. The change in temperature and humidity felt in the cockpit was likely another sign of huge amounts of water or ice being suddenly sucked into the engines, partially overwhelming the air conditioning system. 20 seconds later, the background noise intensified and changed into a sound of ice crystals now hitting the cockpit. The turbulence intensified and the first officer reduced the commanded speed from Mach 0.82 to 0.8, which was the turbulence penetration speed. This caused the autothrottle to reduce the thrust back to 84% N1. Up until this point, the aircraft had been performing flawlessly and the two pilots were relaxed and just monitoring the autopilot doing its job. We don't know for sure what caused it, but it is very likely that the ice crystals, who were now pelting the aircraft outside, started to overwhelm the heating elements of the pitot probes who were providing crucial information to the three air data modules. At time 02:10 and 5 seconds, the autopilot and autothrottle suddenly disconnected with the associated cavalry charge warning in the cockpit. At the same moment, a heavy gust of wind caused the aircraft to start banking sharply to the right. The first officer called out, "I have controls," and reached for his side stick. Now, this sudden onset of warnings and aircraft behavior would have likely caused a severe startle to both pilots, and the confusion would have set in almost immediately. But at this point, the aircraft was still flying reasonably level, with only this right bank developing. As the aircraft continued banking right, the indicated airspeed on the captain's primary flight display, as well as on the standby indicator, suddenly dropped from 275 knots to 60 knots, a clearly erroneous indication. We don't know for sure what the first officer's instruments showed, as they weren't recorded on the flight data recorder, but they likely also fell with a similar amount. Remember what I told you about how the altimeter system compensated the pressure for higher Mach numbers? Well, because the speed was now indicated as much lower, the altimeter system recalculated its altitude and suddenly showed a drop of 300 feet as well as a negative vertical speed. The first officer, who had been suddenly thrown into hand flying the aircraft, now reacted instinctively by giving left aileron and pitching up to correct his altitude. This was the start of the sequence of events that would ultimately doom this flight. Since all three ADRs were now showing unreliable data, the aircraft reverted into alternate law, which meant that the angle of attack protections were lost, as well as the overspeed and bank protections. Now, like I mentioned before, the roll control now also became about twice as sensitive, meaning that the first officer had to really concentrate in order to get the aircraft to stop banking and return to level flight. He started overcorrecting, and the movements he made with the side stick started causing more oscillations, going from right to left and then back again. It is very possible that most of the first officer's attention went to this part of the handling at this point, but remember, he had also started pitching up. That pitch was now increasing, leading into a very high rate of climb. Almost instantaneously, as the autopilot disconnected and all of the different warnings started, a brief stall warning could also be heard in the cockpit. When the warning sounded, the relief pilot called out, "What is that?" Likely because of the quick nature of the warning, but it could also potentially indicate a confusion about its meaning. The flight directors were not disconnected by the crew, as the procedure for airspeed unreliable instructed them to do, but the command bars disappeared anyway due to lack of reliable data. 11 seconds into the sequence, the pitch of the aircraft had reached 11 degrees nose up, and the first officer was making max left and right side stick inputs, still overcorrecting. He also now called, we haven't got good display," likely referring to the lack of speed info. The relief pilot, who was supposed to handle the ECAM warnings and the non-normal checklist, called out, "We've lost the speeds and alternate low protection low." He then continued to read out the ECAM messages, but in a manner that was hard to understand and very rushed. Here, it would have been absolutely crucial to clearly point out that the aircraft was in alternate law, meaning that it would handle differently and that certain protections were lost. He mentioned that the auto thrust was lost, and the first officer responded by asking, "Engine lever?" showing some confusion about what the relief pilot was saying. Since the autothrottle had disconnected when the failure occurred, the thrust had gone into a mode called engine thrust locked, which basically meant that it was keeping its previously selected value of 84%. ECAM instructed the crew to move the thrust lever manually to resume thrust control, but instead the first officer pushed the autothrottle disconnect button and left the thrust lever where it was, which was in the climb detent. And because of that, the thrust now started to increase into climb thrust. All of what I've said so far happened in the first 18 seconds of this emergency. There were 10 different ECAM messages showing up, each of them causing a chime in the cockpit. On top of this, the master warning and the master caution light was illuminated in front of the pilots, as well as a constant C chord chime, indicating that the aircraft had left its cleared altitude. This would have been a very confusing and stressful environment for the pilots. And the fact that unreliable airspeed was not indicated on the ECAM, this was something that the pilots needed to figure out themselves. That might have been the reason why they didn't start executing that procedure at that point. At time 02:10 and 26 seconds, the aircraft pitch-up attitude had reached 12 degrees nose up. The aircraft was now climbing with a hair-raising 6,900 feet per minute, more than 7 times higher than the normal rate would be as it passed 36,000 feet. Maintaining a rate this high meant that the aircraft was now rapidly exchanging speed for altitude. Suddenly, the flight director bars reappeared in front of the first officer, but instead of being engaged in the altitude hold mode that they were before, they're now engaged in vertical speed mode, since they activated in the middle of a climb. This meant that the flight directors were now starting to show the pilots the pitch needed to maintain their current 6,000 feet per minute climb. That would definitely not have been helpful in this situation, when the first officer was likely becoming more and more overloaded by noise and workload. And it was precisely because of this that the unreliable airspeed memory items included turning off the flight directors. The relief pilot now looked away from the ECAM display, which he had stopped reading anyway, and reached to switch on the wing anti-ice. And that's when he noticed the high pitch that the aircraft was keeping. He called out, "Watch your speed," possibly referring to the vertical speed, since the speed indication still hadn't returned. The first officer replied, okay, I'm going back down," and started pitching forward, but not nearly enough. This only reduced the climb rate, but the aircraft continued to climb. The relief pilot continued to call out that he needed to stabilize, go back down, and according to all three, you are going up, so go back down, to which the first officer responded, "Okay." The pitch now momentarily reduced to about 10 degrees pitch up, which still gave a climb rate of about 4,000 feet per minute. They now climbed through their calculated max altitude of 37,000 feet, and at time 02:10 and 36 seconds, the flight directors disappeared again, but the airspeed came back on the left side, indicating the correct speed of 223 knots. That meant that up until this point, the aircraft had lost about 50 knots of pressurized airspeed, and the speed was still reducing. The flight directors again flashed up for about a second, disappeared, and then came back again, commanding a climb of about 1,400 feet per minute, which was what the aircraft was doing at that time. At time 02:10 and 47 seconds, the first officer inexplicably now reduced the thrust back to around 85% N1. And this is likely a sign of his increasing loss of situational awareness and disorientation. The relief pilot pushed the call button to try and get the captain back into the cockpit again. He pressed it several times, asking, "Where is he?" He also reached over and switched the air data selector and the attitude heading selector to first officer on 3. These are switches designed to change the data input for the displays, and they were not items covered in any checklist. He likely switched these in an attempt to try and restore the instrument that he felt were missing for the first officer. 3 seconds later, the stall warning went off in the cockpit and sounded continuously for the next 45 seconds. The fact that this warning was now sounding continuously was not verbalized or even discussed by any of the pilots. Instead, the first officer reacted by pulling back on the controls, increasing the pitch attitude to 16 degrees nose up, similar to what you would have on takeoff. This pitch-up command now also meant that the stabilizer at the back of the aircraft started moving into the max nose-up position, making a potential recovery even harder. The aircraft now no longer had enough energy to keep the requested climb rate. Instead, it started to slowly level off, rocking from side to side, which the first officer desperately tried to counteract with the side stick. They were now rapidly closing in on a fully developed stall. Now, a stall happens when the aircraft wing has moved beyond its critical angle of attack, meaning that it effectively stops being able to create lift, and instead the aircraft will start to fall. A stall can happen at any attitude. The only thing that determines when it happens is the angle of attack, and the angle of attack is the angle between the wing chord line and the oncoming airflow. Both pilots had received initial training on how to deal with an approach to stall and recovery during the type ratings years ago, but they would have never experienced the feeling of a fully developed stall in the real aircraft. The fact that the Airbus only has an audio warning, not a visual stall indication in front of the pilots or a stick shaker, might also have played a part in explaining why the warning wasn't reacted to, because one of the first things that disappears when a human is under stress is their hearing. At time 02:10 and 57 seconds, the aircraft reached its stall angle of attack and violent buffeting started to shake the aircraft. This type of buffeting is of a much higher frequency than turbulence is, and it feels very different. The first officer now added full toga thrust. But at this altitude, above the aircraft's maximum performance altitude, the engines were not able to produce enough thrust to even keep the speed, much less accelerate it. The relief pilot called out, above all, try to touch the lateral controls as little as possible, showing some insight into the issues with flying in alternate law. But this fell on deaf ears as the first officer continued to make max left and right inputs. The relief pilot also said, "Is he coming or not?" referring to the captain. The first officer now called out, "I'm in toga," referring to the fact that he had added thrust, which he might have thought would be enough to solve the situation. The aircraft still climbed a few hundred feet more until it reached its maximum recorded altitude of 37,924 feet, and then it started falling down towards the sea below. Now you might ask yourselves, why didn't the relief pilot just take controls? He was asking for corrections that didn't happen. Well, we will never know the answer to that, but it likely lies in the fact that this all happened quite fast. It only took about 1 minute to reach this point. Also, the fact that he couldn't see or feel the input his colleague was making on the side stick, since those aren't connected to each other in the Airbus, made it hard to monitor what his colleague was actually doing. At time 02:11 and 7 seconds, the last bit of ice inside of the pitot tubes had been cleared by the heating elements, and both the standby and left airspeed indicator now started working again. The speed indicated was 183 knots, meaning that they had lost around 90 knots of airspeed. The aircraft now entered into an increasingly rapid descent, with the stall warning sounding continuously. The relief pilot called out, "But we've got the engines, what's happening?" And then, "Do you understand what's happening?" But he got no reply. The aircraft started banking over towards the right, which prompted the first officer to give continuous left side stick, but with very little effect. The first officer also continued his pitch up command with his side stick and would be doing that continuously for the next 40 seconds. Now, for all of those out there who cannot believe how it was possible for the first officer to react this way, there are a few things that are worth thinking about. The first is that the human brain does not perform well under stress, and we tend to revert to our training when that happens. And that brings me to my second point, which is how the Airbus functions when it's flown in normal law. You see, the best possible climb performance you can get from the aircraft is achieved through applying continuous back pressure and toga thrust. That's what's used during a wind shear or a terrain escape maneuver, for example. Since the aircraft will not allow it to stall, it will only pitch to maintain close to its maximum angle of attack, whilst using max thrust, giving the best possible performance. But that only works in normal law. If you apply that logic, the actions of the overstressed first officer becomes maybe a little bit more understandable. At time 02:11 and 32 seconds, the first officer called out that he didn't have control of the aircraft anymore, no control at all. The relief pilot responded by saying, "Controls to the left," and pressed the takeover button to take controls, but he never verbalized that takeover formally. He then made 2 brief inputs to the left of his own controls before the first officer took back the controls again and continued with his own inputs, aft and left, none of which was working. At this point, the aircraft descent rate had increased to around 10,000 feet per minute, and the angle of attack was close to 40 degrees, meaning that the aircraft was now more falling than flying. Because it was maintaining such an incredibly high angle of attack, the air was now hitting the aircraft from below at a 40 to 60 degree angle. This would have caused a very strange wind noise in the cockpit, but also crucially, the angle that the air was hitting the pitot tubes and the static ports with was now so extreme that the pressure became almost equal on both. This meant that the speed indication once again disappeared as the computer interpreted those conditions as being completely impossible and unreliable. So the reason that the crew now once again found themselves without valid speed indication had nothing to do with ice from this point on. It was only due to their extreme aircraft situation. Once the speed value dropped below 60 knots, the onboard computers told the stall warning system to disregard the angle of attack vanes outside, because such a speed could only be encountered on the ground. This made the stall warning stop in the cockpit, and as the calculated speed fell below 30 knots, the speed indication was replaced by speed flags on the pilot display. At this point, the first officer also said something that gives a bit of an insight to why he was acting the way he did. He said, "I have the impression that we have the speed." It's unclear what he was basing this feeling on, but it could be just his senses together with the increase in wind noise from outside and possibly the buffeting that he was feeling. In any case, the silencing of the stall warning coincided with the captain returning to the cockpit at time 02:11 and 42 seconds. That was about 1 minute and a half after the autopilot disconnected and less than 1 minute after he was called back. He was faced with a completely unrealistic scene. There was no stall warning at this point for the reason that I just explained, but the aircraft was descending with an incredible vertical speed and they were just passing 35,000 feet, the same altitude they had maintained when he left the cockpit. The pitch attitude was varying between 15 degrees nose up and 9 degrees nose down, and he could see 10 different ECAM warnings, master warning lights, together with severe buffeting which was shaking the aircraft. The captain asked, "What are you doing?" To which the relief pilot desperately answered, "What's happening? Well, I don't know what's happening." The first officer also chimed in, "We're losing control of the aircraft here," and the relief pilot added, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." The first officer now reduced the engines to idle, and given their position below the wings, this and some actual pitch down commands finally caused the aircraft to pitch down to about 11 degrees below the horizon. The first officer said, "I have a problem. It's that I don't have vertical speed. I have no more displays." And the relief pilot said, "We have no valid indications." The vertical speed indication might have been indicating full down at this point, or it could indeed be missing as the computer rendered any value above 20,000 feet per minute as invalid. But the fact that they were now finally pitching down caused the speed to start increasing and the angle of attack to decrease slightly. But in a cruel twist of fate, because the speed now started increasing, the stall warning system again noticed that it had valid indications and started sounding, giving the perverse effect of indicating stall when the nose was pitching down, but disappearing again when it was pitched back up. This must have been extremely confusing for the pilots, but fully in line with the aircraft system design at the time, because no aircraft was ever thought to even get close to that kind of situation that they now found themselves in. The first officer now said, "I have the impression that we have some crazy speed. What do you think?" He then reached over and deployed the speed brake, but was immediately told to stow it again by his colleagues. Now, this further indicates that the first officer indeed thought that the aircraft was in an overspeed and not in the fully developed stall that they actually were. As the pilots were now trying to troubleshoot, the aircraft was descending with between 10 to 15,000 feet per minute, with the nose oscillating between 8 degrees nose down and 15 degrees nose up. Each time it pitched down, the stall warning would activate, and when it pitched up again, it would silence. The bank angle varied between 20 and 40 degrees to the right, and it's likely that it was mostly the yaw damper which was controlling the rudder who kept the aircraft from going into a spin. At time 02:12 and 10 seconds, the thrust was again moved into the climb detent, and 20 seconds later, the aircraft stopped banking to the right and instead started oscillating left and right, which the first officer continued to try and correct with his side stick. The relief pilot asked the captain, "What do you think? What do we need to do?" But the captain, who had not been informed about the nature of the initial failure nor about the rapid climb in the beginning of the emergency, was completely perplexed. He just answered, "There, I don't know, there it's going down," clearly just trying to orient himself of what he was seeing on the different instruments. In the following seconds, there are a lot of confused call-outs from all three pilots. The first officer, who was still in control, was asking things like, "Am I going down now?" To which the relief pilot responded, "Go down," and the captain, "No, you're climbing there," most likely referring to his pitch attitude, not to what the aircraft was actually doing. At some point here, the first officer actually positions the side stick fully forward for a few seconds. This causes a pitch down and the speed to start increasing, and with that, stall warning came back and the first officer confirms the engines to be in toga. This is again an indication of this being his go-to response for the stall warning. He then asked, "What do we have on Alti?" referring to the altimeter reading, which was about 20,000 feet at this point. Now this is a bit strange, since he should be seeing his altitude in front of him, but unfortunately we cannot be sure if the first officer had any valid instruments at all in front of him, since the flight data recorder didn't capture it. Later examinations of the different failure modes in the computers seems to indicate that he did have it. The captain muttered, "It's impossible," showing that he still couldn't figure out what was going on. During the following seconds, the pilots kept discussing the attitude of the aircraft and how to get the wings horizontal. The confusion is obvious and excruciating to listen to. The first officer explained that he is at the limit with the roll controls, and the captain then suggested that he could use a bit of left rudder to try to stop the right bank. This actually seemed to help momentarily as the aircraft rolled over slightly to the left, but soon continued banking right again. The aircraft descended through 10,000 feet, and the first officer called out, we're there, we're passing level 100. At this point, there was likely very little the pilot could have done to save this aircraft. But the relief pilot now called out, wait, me, I have controls, and then started making left inputs, but the first officer never let go of his control, so the warning
dual input
was now heard multiple times for the coming seconds. The first officer called out, how come we're continuing to go down? And as he was saying this, the relief pilot instructed the captain to try and reset the flight control computers, which he did, but the captain also said that it wouldn't make any difference. The relief pilot then started calling out, climb, 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 to which the first officer responded, but I've been at max nose up for a while. That last remark likely finally made the captain understand what was going on, and he called out, no, don't climb. The relief pilot said, so go down, and pushed his side stick forward, but the first officer was still holding his side stick backwards, causing a new dual input warning. And since the two inputs were now averaged, nothing happened. The relief pilot called out, so give me the controls to me, controls to me. First officer responded, go ahead, you have the controls, we're still in toga. The nose was now lowered 7 degrees below the horizon, and the speed indication came back together with another stall warning. 7 seconds later, despite having given the controls to the relief pilot, the first officer again started pulling back on the controls, causing another dual input alert. The thrust levels was also momentarily pulled back to idle and then moved forward again, likely to try and achieve any type of change to the situation. The captain called out from the jump seat, watch out, you're pitching up there. But it now seems like the relief pilot had changed his mind about the strategy, because he called out, I'm pitching up, I'm pitching up. And when the captain continued to warn about doing that, he responded, well, we need to do it, we're at 4,000 feet. The next thing that could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder was the GPWS system calling out,
sink rate, pull up,
as the aircraft fell through 2,500 feet. This caused the captain to also change his mind, and he called out, go on, pull, as the first officer chimed in, let's go, pull up, pull up, pull up. Both pilots now pulled maximum back on their side stick, causing the nose to pitch up 16 degrees above the horizon. The speed at this point was 107 knots forward, but an equal heart-wrenching 107 knots downwards. At time 02, 14 and 22 seconds, the first officer again pushed his takeover button and kept it pressed. This locked out the control from the relief pilot. The synthetic cockpit voice recorder called out,
priority right.
The first officer now pulled in panic back and called out, damn, we're going to crash, followed by, this can't be true, and what's happening? The captain barked out an order, 10 degrees pitch up, while the stall and GPWS warnings were blaring in the background. The relief pilot now tried for the last time to pitch forward, but since the first officer was holding the takeover button, his inputs had no effect. Even if they would have, this was far too late to do anything about the situation. At time 02, 14 and 28 seconds, the Airbus 330 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle and a vertical speed of 10,900 feet per minute. The forces exerted on the airframe was equivalent to someone being dropped from the 46th floor of a building straight into the ground. It immediately shattered the aircraft into thousands of pieces, and all 228 people on board were immediately lost. Completely unaware of the horrific fate of the aircraft, the 4 control centers that were planned to be in contact with the flight soon started contacting each other to verify if anyone had heard anything from the aircraft. It soon became clear that there had been no sign from the flight since time 0135, and the crew hadn't checked in at the various position checkpoints that they should have. Since the problem with HF radio contact was not uncommon in this part of the Atlantic Ocean, no one took any particular notice of this for the first few hours. There continued to be several calls made between the different ATC centers verifying if anything had been heard, and other aircraft flying on the same route were asked to try and contact the flight, but with no success. The same went for trying to contact them via SATCOM, which is a type of satellite telephone, as well as ACARS messages sent from Air France. 3 hours after the accident, the flight was first registered as missing, and a further 3 hours later the first emergency message was sent out by Madrid in Spain, and as well as from Senegalese ATC control centers. This triggered the first search and rescue planes to be sent out towards the last known location of the aircraft. On the 2nd of June 2009, 2 days after the accident, the first floating debris was spotted on the ocean surface, and 3 days later the first debris and victims were recovered from the sea. This was the beginning of a 2-year-long search and rescue effort that included charting the entire underwater terrain in the area where the aircraft was thought to have gone down. The search was divided into several campaigns, with the last one starting in March of 2011, and on the 2nd of April that year, the wreckage was finally located on a relatively flat area at the sea floor at a depth of about 12,800 feet and 6.5 miles away from its last ACARS transmitted position. This meant that thousands of pieces could be recovered, including both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which were miraculously in good condition. The fact that both recorders were found was what finally led to the final report and the details that I've just told you. So, what conclusions did the final report bring? Why did this horrible accident actually happen? Well, the fact was that no component on the aircraft actually failed. But the pitot tubes and their heating elements were temporarily overwhelmed by external factors that were likely outside of what they had been certified for. This then led to a loss of reliable airspeed, and that in turn caused a cascade of temporary system degradations, warnings and autopilot disconnections that caused a severe startle to the operating crew. The crew was expected to apply the procedure for unreliable airspeed, but never did so. Instead, the initial pitch-up reaction by the pilot flying led to a continuously worsening energy situation, which was discovered late by the pilot monitoring. The subsequent corrections were too small, leading to the aircraft exiting the flight performance envelope and entering into a sustained stall. This fact was not understood by the pilot, most likely because of lack of training, but possibly also because they might have thought that the warning was erroneous since it didn't match their mental model of what was going on. In any case, the stall conditions was never discussed or verbalized by the pilots during the whole sequence. The lack of identification of that stall meant that the crew never initiated any countermeasures against it. This accident sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and led to several safety recommendations, including the formation of a formal upset prevention and recovery technique training module for all pilots out there. That included the effects of high altitude flying and stall recoveries. It also led to new memory items for flight with unreliable airspeed, which are now focused on disconnecting automatics and setting correct pitch and power immediately to keep the aircraft flying safe before starting any troubleshooting. The investigation also recommended the insertion of a camera in the cockpit to show all instruments indications, as well as several other recommendations around the pitot probes, black boxes, the Airbus stall warning system, as well as search and rescue improvements. Several other recommendations were also made, but the most important lessons that we pilots need to take away from this accident are that we really need to understand the aircraft that we're flying. That means understanding all of the systems, what happens if those systems are degraded, and also how the aircraft might react differently when flying at high altitude versus at low altitude. And lastly, never forget to continue to fly the aircraft. If a startle happens, remember that pitch and power will keep you safe. Keep the aircraft flying, and only after that try to figure out what has actually happened. As long as the aircraft is flying, there will be plenty of time to troubleshoot. As always, this story was based on the accident final report, but due to its complexity and the many human factors involved, I've also used several other sources, and I want to specially mention Understanding Air France 447 by Bill Palmer, which was instrumental in broadening my system's understanding of the Airbus 330. I highly recommend it. Why would you ever try to land an aircraft from a crazy approach like this? Well, when you're flying a route that you've flown loads of times before, it's easy to just kind of relax and maybe drop your guard a bit. But sometimes these familiar scenarios can turn into something completely new, and if you aren't careful then, these easy approaches can turn into something really, really dangerous. Stay tuned. Southwest Airlines is right now the fourth largest airline in the United States, and it's also known as the largest Boeing 737 operator in the world. Over its more than 50-year history, Southwest has almost exclusively operated 737s, and today it has a fleet with over 800 of them flying. One of those was the one used in this story, a classic Boeing 737-300, registered as November 668 Sierra Whiskey. And on the 5th of March 2000, it had been scheduled to operate the late afternoon flight 1455 from Las Vegas, Nevada, over to Burbank International Airport in Southern California. This was not a very long flight, just about an hour and 15 minutes from gate to gate, and it was also a route which the pilots scheduled to operate on this day were very familiar with. In command was a 52-year-old captain who had extensive previous experience in both the Air Force, corporate jets, and of course passenger airliners, and he had been working for Southwest Airlines since 1988. On this day, he had around 11,000 flying hours in total, almost all of which had been flown on the Boeing 737, and his colleagues described him as an average pilot with a friendly, easygoing attitude. Joining him in the cockpit was a 43-year-old first officer who had been with Southwest for a little over 3 years at this point, after having previously spent 12 years with the US Air Force. He had about 5,000 total hours, of which almost exactly half were on the Boeing 737, and he was described as an above-average pilot by captains who had flown with him. He was also active in the Air Force Reserves, where he occasionally still flew the F-16, something that he had actually done as recently as 2 days before this story began. Both pilots had been off duty for quite a while before this flight, which was to be the first of a 3-day, 5-flight trip sequence together. And the captain also lived in Las Vegas, so he was likely feeling quite well rested as the day began. This would have been a bread and butter flight for these pilots, but especially for the captain who had been flying between Las Vegas and Burbank dozens, if not hundreds of times during his career so far. But a couple of aspects of the flight on this day were just slightly different than usual. You see, despite Las Vegas' famously hot and dry weather, the weather at the city's McCarran International Airport was on this day quite volatile, with thunderstorms reported near the field and all along the route over towards Burbank. The thunderstorms had even triggered a wind shear warning at the airport, which was a very rare thing in Las Vegas. Now, this region of bad weather was also affecting Southern California, and as it turned out, the aircraft that was later supposed to operate Flight 1455 had been delayed on the ground in Los Angeles for almost 2 hours due to these storms. As a result, the pilots arrived at McCarran Airport to find that the plane they were supposed to use wasn't there yet, and their scheduled departure time of 14:45 came and went with no sign of the aircraft turning up. So when the plane actually finally arrived at time 16:30, the pilots and crew hurriedly boarded their passengers and ran through the pre-flight checks to try and save up some time, and they managed to do so very, very quickly. Actually, by time 16:50, after having boarded all 137 passengers and 3 flight attendants, Flight 1455 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing towards the runway only 20 minutes after the plane had first arrived to the gate. And as a fellow 737 pilot, I can attest to that being very fast. As the pilots completed their performance calculations, they had noted that the airplane was unusually heavy, despite the short flight and relatively normal passenger load. And the exact reason for this extra weight aren't clearly explained in the accident report, but 3,000 extra pounds of fuel had been added beyond the normal quantity in order to allow the plane to fly all the way back to Las Vegas if it couldn't land in Burbank. So that likely accounted for it. Now, this extra fuel would also mean that the aircraft would be close to its maximum allowed landing weight when it arrived to their destination, and that's worth keeping in mind. Anyway, after having taxied out to the runway, Flight 1455 soon received its takeoff clearance, and the pilots executed a normal takeoff with the captain as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. The climb phase was then completely uneventful, and they soon reached their cruising altitude, leveled off, and started heading southwest over the Mojave Desert. Whilst en route, the pilots requested deviations around a couple of thunderstorms, and the flight experienced some mild turbulence, but nothing that posed any real difficulty for the crew. Now, we routinely avoid thunderstorms en route, and our weather radar is more than capable of detecting these cells to allow us to avoid them, so this would not have been in any way bothering for the crew. After less than an hour, the pilots then requested and initiated their initial descent, during which time the cockpit voice recorder captured them chatting about their careers and about a United Airlines flight that had nearly struck terrain after takeoff from San Francisco back in 1988, something that was now being used as a training scenario in the airline. They also talked about the situation they were expecting to encounter once they started approaching Burbank. And to understand what the pilots thought lay ahead of them, I want to talk a little bit more about this particular airport. Hollywood Burbank is a domestic airport located about 18 kilometers north of downtown Los Angeles, in the southeastern corner of the San Fernando Valley. It is wedged in quite close to some high terrain, including a mountain that rises to 3,000 feet immediately east of the field, as well as the Hollywood Hills, a short distance to the south, who reaches a height of 1,700 feet. It has two runways, runway 0826, a line from west to east, and runway 1533, which runs from northwest to southeast. Now, due to the terrain restrictions I just mentioned, only runway 08 had an instrument landing system, an ILS, and the vast majority of traffic flying into Burbank tended to land on that runway. The reciprocal runway 26 was very difficult for airliners to use due to the high hills just 3 nautical miles from the threshold, so if the tailwinds were too strong to land on runway 08, then runway 33 was usually used instead. By the time the CVR recording started, the pilots were already aware of a reported 18-knot tailwind on runway 08, so the captain commented that they would probably need to land on runway 33, since he couldn't even recall ever using runway 26. Moments later, he then also gave a quick briefing, in which he anticipated a visual approach to runway 33 that they would use flap 40, and also repeated the local altimeter setting. Then, at time 1802, the flight crew were handed over from the previous controller to the woodland sector of the so-called TRACON, a massive combined air traffic control facility that funnels traffic into numerous airports throughout the Los Angeles area. Immediately after establishing contact, the woodland controller told Flight 1455 to expect an ILS approach to runway 08, which, like I mentioned, was the default instrument approach into Burbank. This approach was much more familiar to the pilots than the visual approach that they had just briefed, so that likely meant that, in the captain's eyes at least, the task ahead of him had now just gotten way easier. But like I've already said, nothing about this flight had been exactly normal so far, from the weather to the weight to the fast turnaround, and as we will soon see, the notion that this would be a normal approach was also misguided. Flight 1455 was now located around 21 nautical miles north of the threshold of runway 08, southwest from the Palmdale VOR radio beacon and following the normal arrival route. As inbound traffic reaches this area, the woodland sector controller normally gives them radar vectors to intercept the runway 08 approach at a distance of between 10 to 15 nautical miles from the runway threshold. ATC procedures required the controller to provide vectors that would result in an intercept angle of 30 degrees or less, basically so that the flight crew wouldn't have to turn so sharply to intercept the final approach, since that could lead to them overshooting. This usually also meant that the controller would send aircraft quite far to the west before vectoring them back in for a more shallow intercept, although occasionally a steeper intercept angle closer to the runway was being used. The exact vectors given by air traffic control during this phase varied somewhat depending on the traffic situation, because the controller's job also included to sequence aircraft out by keeping them at a certain distance apart from each other, using whatever means they had at their disposal. That could mean giving some flights longer or shorter vectors, but could also mean issuing speed restrictions intended to prevent faster aircraft from catching up to slower, or just to extend the distance between them. In this case, a different Southwest aircraft, Flight 1713, was ahead of Flight 1455 and had received vectors to intercept the approach course about 12 nautical miles away from the runway. At the same time, a business jet was also coming in from the northwest, but it was still quite far out, so the controller's plan was to slot Flight 1455 in ahead of it, basically between these two flights. But if the controller vectored Flight 1455 too far to the west before turning them inbound, the business jet would catch up. So he now decided to instead start vectoring the flight early, beginning at time 1803 with a left turn to 190 degrees and a descent down to 6,000 feet. The first officer acknowledged this, and the pilots then started the descending turn, which would take them towards a more southwesterly direction. But just 30 seconds later, the controller also instructed Flight 1455 to maintain an airspeed of 230 knots or greater until advised. Now, keeping Flight 1455 at a speed of 230 knots would increase the distance between that flight and the business jet behind them, which was flying at 210 knots. But in hindsight, this probably wasn't even necessary, because the controller was also about to give Flight 1455 a shortcut. Now, these kinds of speed restrictions are super common on approaches to busy airports, so the pilots likely weren't surprised at all by receiving one. They just acknowledged the restriction and then carried on. But the combination of keeping a higher speed than normal, being heavy, and receiving shortcuts is a tricky combo, as we will soon see. As they continued, the first officer also calculated that their approach reference speed, or VREF, should be 133 knots at their current weight, and since the new weather report mentioned a 6-knot tailwind, company policy was to fly the approach at VREF plus 5 knots, which would mean 138 knots in total. That meant that they now had to lose almost 100 knots between their position they were now at on the downwind and the final approach. But the controller didn't say how long this speed restriction would last, so it was unclear how much time the pilots would have to decelerate. Seconds later though, the controller cleared them to descend to 5,000 feet and to turn left onto a southeasterly heading of 160 degrees. This new heading put the aircraft on a course to intercept the approach track at just under 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, which was unusually close. In fact, this clearance cut about 6 miles from the expected approach track that the pilots had in mind, which meant that the separation between Flight 1455 and the business jet behind them now increased by that same amount. That effectively eliminated any need for that 230 knot speed restriction, but for whatever reason the controller just forgot to cancel it. Now at this point, the pilots should have recognized that they were in a position where it might not be possible to stabilize the approach, so they should have reported unable to this clearance and asked for more track miles, or at least to get free speed. But that didn't happen. And to understand why, I want to talk about two things here. One, the stabilized approach concept, and two, Southwest Airlines company culture at the time. You see, every airline around the world uses the stabilized approach concept to ensure that approaches are only continued to a landing if all parameters are indicating that it's safe to do so. Under this concept, pilots are taught that the approach is stabilized if the aircraft is fully configured for landing with all flight parameters within a narrow optimal range when reaching the stabilization gate, which is generally at 1,000 feet on an instrument approach or 500 feet on a visual approach. Southwest Airlines used the term "in the slot" to refer to the stabilized approach parameters, which in their case meant being on the glide path with the airspeed within 10 knots of the calculated approach speed, a descent rate of less than 1,000 feet per minute, flaps and gear extended, thrust levels in the correct position, and no major control inputs needed to maintain the glide path and runway alignment. The idea was that if the approach didn't meet all of those requirements at the gate, the pilot should then execute a missed approach. But back in the early 2000s, these kind of rules had gotten a little bit, shall we say, stretched at Southwest Airlines. You see, at the time, Southwest performed a very high rate of visual approaches, basically encouraging its pilots to do so whenever the weather permitted, which in the southwestern US was most of the time. Now, visual approaches can be harder to stabilize due to the lack of automatic course guidance and higher workload, but they often also save time and fuel versus carrying out a full instrument approach, which is something that Southwest was very conscious of. Now, because of this difficulty, it wasn't uncommon for Southwest pilots to find that one or two of those parameters weren't quite in the slot at the stabilization gate, which then should have resulted in a go-around. But instead, most pilots just corrected these parameters below 500 feet and then landed the airplane. Part of the reason for this happening was that Southwest procedures didn't clearly state when exactly a missed approach had to be performed. Most documents just said something like, if you are not in the slot, you are not prepared for a normal landing, but didn't specify that a missed approach had to be flown. At the same time, many Southwest pilots had also begun to judge whether they were in the slot on a visual approach based on what the runway looked like, if it looked right to them, instead of strictly cross-checking all of the required parameters. But making the decision to land based on whether they subjectively believed that they were in a position to make it was obviously totally contrary to the purpose of the stabilized approach concept. An independent review of Southwest's company culture would later reveal that these issues were part of a broader trend in which pilots at the airline were encouraged to complete any approach from which a landing was judged to be possible, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not. Southwest culture was also found to emphasize a fast pace of operations, often featuring hot and high slam-dunk approaches to save time and fuel. And many Southwest pilots even believed that making aggressive visual approaches under very challenging circumstances was a way to develop and maintain good piloting skills. Now, I want to be clear here and say that Southwest wasn't the only airline during that time that encouraged that kind of mindset. But it is also true that this kind of culture increased the level of risk by encouraging pilots to practice difficult scenarios with passengers on board. Now, these kind of challenging approaches can indeed help keep skills sharp, but in general, it's better to confine this type of practice to the simulator so as not to endanger paying passengers, who I can guarantee would not vote for their flight being more risky than absolutely necessary. I would also like to add that this behavior exemplifies one of what we in aviation call the 5 hazardous attitudes, specifically the attitude known as macho. Macho means an "I can do it" attitude, with a tendency to show off or a need to prove oneself in the eyes of others, sometimes by taking risks or completing difficult challenges. According to that independent review that I mentioned before, Southwest Airlines also didn't do enough to mitigate the risks of this operating style, because its training program failed to include adequate techniques for managing the aircraft's energy state during visual approaches, and it also didn't emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. Try to remember both of those points, because they are going to become quite relevant soon. Back on board flight 1455, the pilots now accepted the new heading of 160 degrees, and the captain reminded the first officer that the controller wanted 230 knots or greater for a while. Neither pilot considered asking ATC for more track miles, which actually is another thing that the independent review pointed out, that Southwest pilots were reluctant to respond to air traffic control that they were unable to complete a clearance, which is also a classic macho trait. Anyway, After a little less than a minute, the controller again called up Flight 1455 to mention the presence of Flight 1713, which was now at their 1 o'clock position 12 miles out, turning inbound towards the approach and descending out of 4,600 feet. The controller also asked if they would like to make a visual approach to runway 08 instead of an ILS approach, and the first officer asked the captain if they should take that offer, provided that they could get the traffic in sight. At the time, the aircraft was still in a layer of clouds, but they expected to break out into visual conditions quite soon, so the captain told the first officer that they would have to wait and see if they could do that. Over the next minute, the pilots told the cabin crew to prepare for arrival, while a traffic control informed them that Flight 1713 was now over Van Nuys at 3,000 feet. Van Nuys is a major single-runway general aviation airport located 6 nautical miles west of the approach end of Burbank's runway 08. This airport presents an obstacle to Burbank arrival since it's one of the busiest general aviation airports in the world, with more than 230,000 annual aircraft movements, quite a lot more than Burbank itself, in fact. The Van Nuys VOR, located at the north end of the field, was a major landmark on the runway 08 approach, and the minimum altitude over that beacon was set at 3,000 feet in order to keep airliners above the Van Nuys traffic pattern. Now, the approach path of runway 08 actually crosses over the southern tip of Van Nuys runway, but airliners approaching Burbank can still descend below 3,000 feet there, provided that they're performing an instrument approach, because separation from the ILS glide slope is baked into Van Nuys traffic procedures. Anyway, Flight 1455 now broke through the clouds, and the first officer announced that they could see Van Nuys airport ahead of them. Seconds later, the captain called out that he had Flight 1713 in sight, and the first officer reported this to the air traffic controller, who in response cleared Flight 1455 for a visual approach to runway 08 with a restriction to cross Van Nuys at 3,000 feet or above, since they now weren't using an instrument landing system approach. But that instruction was a little bit ambiguous, because the official definition of an altitude restriction states that it is an altitude to be maintained until a specific point or time, but no specific endpoint was given here, since they wouldn't end up flying over Van Nuys. A strict interpretation of this clearance might mean that they could begin descending from 3,000 feet as soon as they passed a beam, the Van Nuys VOR, but this probably wasn't what the controller meant. On the other hand, the captain later told investigators that he wanted to stay well clear of the general aviation traffic, so he interpreted this clearance to mean that they could descend from 3,000 feet only after leaving the airspace immediately around Van Nuys airport. But if they waited that long to descend, well, then they would end up well above the glide path, forcing them to play catch-up by then descending really quickly, which would make it hard or even impossible to bleed off their excess speed. Now, all of this could have been solved by just asking the controller to clarify what he meant, or even better, to ask for a wider pattern. But that didn't happen. Now, because Southwest pilots did visual approaches whenever possible, it's likely that being above the glide path at this point due to the altitude restrictions over Van Nuys was completely normal for these pilots. And it's also worth pointing out that the 230 knot speed restriction had technically been cancelled by the crew receiving an approach clearance, but the controller never explicitly highlighted that. In fact, the captain didn't appear to realize that they were free to slow down until almost a full minute after the approach clearance had been issued, by which time the flight was located 2 nautical miles abeam Van Nuys to the west. At that point, the captain extended the speed brake to start slowing down, while also beginning the left turn to align with the runway for final approach. Now, the autopilot was still engaged at this point, and the pilots had tuned the frequency for the ILS localizer in order to help them align automatically. So, as they approached the centerline, the autopilot now started trying to capture the localizer. But because the controller had vectored them with such a tight intercept angle, the autopilot was now unable to do this in a clean way, and instead ended up overshooting the centerline to the right before starting to correct back to the left over the southern end of Van Nuys. After regaining the approach centerline, the captain instructed the first officer to set flaps 5, the very first step in configuring the aircraft for landing. And as a reference here, in my airline, the aircraft have to be configured with a minimum of flaps 1 at least 10 nautical miles away from the runway and with the speed back to around 180 knots or so. But this aircraft were nowhere near that speed and they were much closer. Shortly after this overshoot intercept, the Woodland controller gave them the frequency for Burbank Tower and then handed them over to receive their landing clearance. The captain now ordered the landing gear to be extended, which the first officer also did, and the captain then disconnected the autopilot and assumed manual control, adding workload to this already complex situation. The first officer, meanwhile, called up Burbank Tower and reported that they were on a visual approach to runway 08, and in response to that, the tower informed them that the wind was now 210 degrees at 6 knots and then cleared them to land with a 6-knot tailwind. It was only now, with the plane located just 3 nautical miles from the threshold, that the captain started their final descent from 3,000 feet. And taking into account the airport elevation of 720 feet, this meant that to land in the touchdown zone, they would have to achieve a descent flight path angle of 7 degrees, which is more than twice the normal approach angle. Losing that much altitude that quickly would also cause the airspeed to increase quite a lot, since the pilots would have to pitch down to do so. So from this point, it was probably physically impossible to decelerate to their calculated approach speed before reaching the runway. So this was the point at which the pilots should have definitely have realized that it would not be possible to stabilize this approach, and therefore they should have just executed a nice and calm go-around. But instead, without discussing their precarious position at all, the captain just continued the approach, calling for flaps 15 and flaps 25 in quick succession. Around this time, he also glanced down onto his flight management display, which shows some performance data, and noticed that they had a 20-knot tailwind, which was way more than the 6 knots that was reported on the ground. The captain thought that this high tailwind must be why they had to use such a high descent rate, because the tailwind was causing a higher than normal ground speed. But in reality, their very high airspeed to begin with was the main cause of this problem. You see, while the captain was probably used to starting the descent at this point, he wasn't used to doing it at such a high speed, which requires a higher descent rate to achieve the glide path due to the decreased time available. If he would have been fully configured and back at his approach speed here, this might still have been possible, but in the situation that they were now in, it was not. The captain found this confusing at first, but the tailwind now gave him a convenient explanation, and that tailwind was going to die down. This also caused him to conclude that the solution was to descend even quicker, into the area closer to the ground where the tailwind was indeed less strong. So, flying manually, he now eyeballed the trajectory he would need in order to reach the runway and then put the airplane into a very steep descent. Seconds later, the Ground Proximity Warning System, the GPWS, detected an unsafe ground closure rate, causing an automated voice to call out
Sink rate, sink rate,
several times. But interestingly, neither pilot acknowledged this caution. Instead, the captain just said, "Flaps 30, just put it down." 3 seconds later, he then also added, "Put it to 40. It won't go, I know that, it's all right. Final descent checklist." What he meant here was that they were actually flying above the flap limit speed for flaps 40. You see, every flap setting has a speed limit associated with it, above which using that flap setting could cause damage to the flap mechanisms. For this reason, the Boeing 737 has a flap load limiting system that doesn't allow the flaps to extend to flaps 40 degrees unless the airspeed is below 158 knots. And since the captain knew that they were above that speed, he also knew that the flaps wouldn't actually reach 40 degrees until they had decelerated below it. In later interviews, the captain said that he knew that they were too fast, but couldn't recall what their actual airspeed was. But according to the flight data recorder, it was still around a terrifying 200 knots at this point, and it wasn't really decreasing at all due to the high descent angle. This meant that flight 1455 was now descending on a very steep glide path with
sink rate,
the alerts blaring and 60 knots above the approach reference speed. So, where was the first officer in all of this? As the pilot monitoring, it was his responsibility to call out deviations from the stabilized approach parameters and also to suggest corrective actions, which in this case would have been to just execute the go-around. But he didn't. He later explained that he had heard the sink rate alerts and had seen their high altitude and speed, but he consciously decided not to call this out because, in his opinion, the captain was aware and already correcting. Now, the problem with that mindset is that as pilot monitoring, he was required to make those call-outs, regardless of whether he thought that the captain was aware of the problem or not. Obviously, the first officer couldn't be inside the captain's head, and he also couldn't be sure that the captain had the full impression of the situation. In fact, the whole reason the pilot monitoring is tasked with calling out deviations is that he or she have less workload than the pilot flying does, and therefore likely a better overall picture of what's going on. So basically, the lesson here is that it doesn't matter why a first officer doesn't speak up. If he's afraid of the captain or because he thinks the captain is handling the situation, it's poor crew resource management either way, and the consequences will end up being the exact same. As it turned out in this situation, the captain wasn't handling it at all. And to understand why, we need to look at what he was actually focused on during the descent and the minutes leading up to it. Now, one way to conceptualize his decision-making is by identifying what it was that made him feel so comfortable that he could make it despite evidence of the contrary. And what seems to have happened here was that every time that he needed to make a decision, some small thing happened that rewarded his choice to continue. Like I mentioned before, at first the crew had expected to land on the less familiar runway 33, but then the wind had died down and the runway was changed over to 08, which in the mind of the pilots made things much easier. Next, they descended out of the clouds and caught sight of both the runway and the airplane ahead of them, allowing the pilots to quickly assess that they could make a visual approach. Then, during the final descent, when the captain noticed that he needed to use an abnormally steep descent rate, he realized that there was a 20-knot tailwind at altitude, causing them to move faster. So he concluded that this problem could be solved by quickly descending to a lower altitude, where the reported tailwind was much lower. Having decided that, he then visually assessed their position relative to the runway and concluded that the picture looked relatively normal to him. Yes, they were definitely a bit high and fast, but he had probably been high and fast on this approach before, and he had always landed without any problems. But what the captain obviously didn't consider was that at their current airspeed and with their high gross weight, the energy state of the aircraft was now super high, even though the view of the runway ahead, in his opinion at least, didn't look that bad. He also didn't consider that he was about to try to land this heavy, fast-moving aircraft onto a relatively short runway, only about 6,000 feet, which was still wet from the recent rain that had recently passed, and which also had absolutely no safety margin at the far end. Just a blast fence and then the city. This is actually a perfect example of why it can be so dangerous to normalize risky behavior and routinely disregard warnings. Because when the sink rate caution sounded, they also failed to bring him out of his complacency because he was using a high sink rate on purpose to get out of the tailwind and regain the flight path. And if we're being totally honest here, he probably had heard sink rate alarms before, again, given the frequent use of steep visual approaches. So by this point, having convinced himself that he actually was in a position to land, his main concern now became the spacing between his aircraft and the other Southwest flight ahead of them. You see, they had slowed down in a normal manner, so flight 1455 was now starting to catch up with them due to their high speed. And that concerned the captain a bit, since it looked like the slower flight might not be able to clear the runway in time for him to land. That distraction just added to his loss of situational awareness here, where no matter how good he thought that the visual picture was, he just didn't appreciate that the real problem he was now facing was his own aircraft's high kinetic energy and the lack of runway ahead of them. Now, Southwest 737s were equipped with an onboard performance computer capable of calculating their landing distance given certain parameters. And Southwest standard operating procedures called for the pilots to use that computer whenever the performance capabilities of the aircraft were in question, like when landing on a short runway with tailwind or landing with high gross weights, all of which were present here. But because they were convinced that this was just another normal approach in Burbank, neither of the pilots seemed to have considered using this computer to calculate their proper landing distance. If they would have done so, they would have seen just how tight the landing distance actually was, even with the correct approach speed, and the danger that they were now in would maybe have become a little bit more apparent. But without that information, yet another hole in the slices of the Swiss cheese model had now opened up. Anyway, immediately after the captain had called for flaps 40, the first officer pointed to the airspeed indicator to remind the captain that the flaps would be inhibited, but he still didn't call out their actual airspeed or any reservations about what was happening. He then also responded to the captain's call for the final descent checklist by visually verifying the required items, even though this was supposed to be a challenge and response checklist requiring both pilots to participate. Now, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have to do this, where the other pilot is too busy to take part in the checklist, that's a clear indication that the workload is now so high that you need to do something. Likely go around. As the GPWS kept calling out sync rate in the background, the first officer now verified that they were clear to land and also notified the flight attendants to get seated for landing. Moments later, the sync rate caution were now also joined by an even more serious warning.
Pull up.
Now today, we pilots are taught to respond to this warning by immediately executing a terrain escape maneuver, regardless of whether we have the runway in sight or not. But at Southwest Airlines and many other airlines at that time, pilots were instead taught that if they were flying in visual conditions with the runway clearly in sight, and it was possible to verify with complete confidence that there was no threat of collision with the terrain, well then this warning could potentially be disregarded. Now that mindset is, in my opinion, quite strange, because unless the possibility of a false GPWS alert is mentioned in an airport briefing or in a chart, then hearing this warning means that something is definitely seriously wrong, regardless of whether the runway is visible or not. In this particular case, Flight 1455 was now descending so fast that the plane sensed that it was outside the normal approach envelope. So the GPWS believed that the flight path was leading towards a ground collision rather than a landing. Later, the captain said that he never heard the pull-up call-outs at all, which I guess could be possible because of the stress that he was experiencing. But the first officer said that he did hear them, but believed that the flight path was safe and that the captain was correcting. Again, a very, very strange thing to hear from a competent pilot monitoring. It would actually have been quite interesting to hear exactly at what point this first officer would have thought it was appropriate to intervene. Anyway, as the warnings continued to blare, Flight 1455 blasted through the stabilization gate at 500 feet without a word from either of the pilots. The plane was now descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute, with an airspeed 50 knots above the approach reference speed and with the flaps still not extended to the landing configuration. The captain later also acknowledged that he should have performed a go-around at this point, but explained that he became fixated on the runway. And this kind of fixation or tunnel vision can arise when we're working hard to achieve a concrete visible goal, especially if that goal is challenging to achieve. This is actually known as get-there-itis in the industry, and it's especially common among captains, and this is why we really need a strong, assertive first officer to snap us out of it. But that obviously wasn't happening here. Meanwhile, up ahead of them, Flight 1713 had now cleared the runway, removing what the captain perceived as the last obstacle in his way. The GPWS continued to sound numerous times as they streaked towards the runway, but the captain just said, "That's all right," and the first officer said nothing at all. At a height of 170 feet, the captain started raising the nose to flare for touchdown. And just to give you some reference, we normally flare at around 25 to 30 feet. And 9 seconds after he had started the flare, they touched down on runway 08 at the incredible speed of 182 knots. Now, due to the high speed and steep approach, the touchdown occurred 2,150 feet beyond the threshold, which is well outside the normal touchdown zone located between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. Immediately upon touchdown, the captain activated the thrust reversers, and then he began manual braking much earlier than he would normally in order to help the plane to start decelerating as quickly as possible. But calculations later show that with the prevailing runway conditions, weight and speed, even with maximum manual braking, it would have taken 4,700 feet to bring the speeding plane down to a stop, and they only had 4,150 feet of runway left. This meant that from the moment the captain selected reverse thrust, any possibility of a go-around went out the window, and a crash became inevitable. As the 737 began to decelerate, the flaps finally extended to 40 degrees, but it was now too late to make any real difference. Onlookers at Burbank's nearby passenger terminal watched in horror as the plane hurtled past, clearly moving way too fast to be able to stop within the remaining runway. In the cockpit, the two pilots had now noticed that they weren't slowing down fast enough, and their nonchalance now finally turned into concern, followed by cold, raw fear. The captain now clearly realized what was about to happen and could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder cursing at himself in third person. And he did have good reasons for doing that, because beyond the end of runway 08, there wasn't a long grassy clearway like on other runways. No, instead, there were just 32 feet of open concrete, followed by a solid blast wall designed to deflect jet blast away from the traffic on North Hollywood Way, which runs directly past the threshold of runway 26. When the captain saw this wall rapidly approaching, he used his nose wheel tiller to steer to the right, aiming across the ramp and towards the open airport fence to avoid a collision with the blast wall. But using the tiller in this way while braking just put the airplane into a skid, which reduced the brake effectiveness even further. So at time 18, 11 and 20 seconds, flight 1455 clipped the right edge of the blast wall and then careened through the perimeter fence at a speed of 32 knots or 60 kilometers per hour. The nose gear collapsed as the plane then slid across 7 traffic lanes on North Hollywood Way, where it collided with one car and then sent debris flying into several others. And on the opposite side of the street was something taken straight out of a nightmare: a petrol station, dead ahead. For a split second, it seemed as though flight 1455 would end up in a deadly fireball. But then, the 737 miraculously came to a stop, right on the edge of the petrol station's parking lot, underneath the big sign advertising the price per gallon. A picture that I'm sure that many of you have actually seen. The aircraft was substantially damaged, but the cabin and cockpit were intact, and all passengers and crew had miraculously survived the crash. On the nearby road, several cars had been damaged in the crash, but incredibly, none of their occupants were seriously hurt either. Inside the cockpit, the captain must have now felt a wave of clarity wash over him as he emerged from his previously fixated state, because he now just said, "My fault," and he then added, "Well, there goes my career." Back in the cabin, the R1 escape slide had inflated inside of the galley area during the crash and was now blocking access to the forward exit doors. But fortunately, the passengers had been able to evacuate through the rear and overwing exits. If there would have been a fire, this would have been a serious problem, but thankfully there was none. So in the end, all 137 passengers and 5 crew members evacuated safely, with only 2 passengers suffering serious injuries, while 41 passengers and the captain sustained minor injuries. In the aftermath of the accident, the Federal Aviation Administration suspended both pilots' licenses for 1 year, and as the captain had predicted, both of them were then also fired from Southwest Airlines. The NTSB found that the cause of the accident was the flight crew's failure to go around at the stabilization gate despite excessive speed and a steep flight path angle, which then resulted in a touchdown with insufficient runway remaining to stop the aircraft. The controller's use of speed and altitude restrictions that unnecessarily put flight 1455 into a position from which a safe approach could not be made was found to have also contributed to the accident. Later, that independent review that I mentioned, commissioned by the Airline Pilots Association, found widespread cultural problems at Southwest Airlines that encouraged pilots to attempt risky approaches without taking due care. In fact, In 2005, another Southwest Airlines flight overran the runway at Chicago's Midway Airport and slid onto a street. And in that accident, which I actually covered on this channel a while back, the flight crew decided to land at Midway, despite very unfavorable conditions due to a perceived pressure to complete the task. After each accident, Southwest implemented reforms to its procedures and training in order to improve its safety culture, and these types of incidents have since become much less common. Thankfully, there was no loss of life in this accident, but it shouldn't be forgotten that if the plane had touched down just a little bit further along or a little bit faster, it might have plowed into that petrol station with catastrophic results. That's why, after this accident, Burbank Airport actually bought the petrol station and another nearby business and replaced them with empty lots in order to prevent that scenario from ever occurring. The airport also equipped the departure end of runway 08 with an engineered materials arrestor system, or EMAS, which stops runaway aircraft using specially engineered gravel underneath a breakable surface. And in 2018, this very EMAS installation stopped another Southwest flight from running off Burbank's runway 08, proving just how valuable these systems are in airports where no proper clearway is possible. Isn't it awesome to see safety work in action? In the morning of July the 31st, 1992, the crew of Thai Airways Flight 311 began what was supposed to be a completely routine service from Bangkok over to Kathmandu. The aircraft being used, an Airbus A310 registered as HSTID, was among the newest in Thai Airways' fleet at the time. It was a modern twin jet with advanced flight management computers and electronic systems that represented the very cutting edge of early 1990s airline technology. The pre-flight preparation had been quite straightforward, with reasonably good weather expected along the route, so at 10:30 local time in Bangkok, the Airbus A310 lifted off from the runway and started flying northwest towards Nepal. In just over 2 hours, the plan was to cross India at cruise level before descending towards the foothills of the Himalayas, whilst entering the non-radar airspace around Kathmandu, and then fly a non-precision approach in towards the destination. On board the aircraft on this day were 99 passengers and 14 crew members, including the 2 pilots who both knew this route quite well. The captain was 41 years old and had 13,250 hours in total, with 4,400 of those being flown on this type. He had joined Thai Airways already back in the 1970s and had recently been promoted to line training captain, a qualification reserved only for those trusted to train others and to stay calm if things would become sticky. His first officer on this day was actually a bit older, a 52-year-old with 14,609 hours of total time and 4,600 hours on type. And he was considered by his colleagues as skilled and diligent, but not particularly assertive. In simulator checks, he generally performed well, but instructors had noted that he lacked the authoritative demeanor expected from a captain, and he had therefore been told that he would never be promoted to captain unless that changed. That would have likely been quite devastating to hear, but the reality is that some personality types do lack that kind of assertiveness, which is normally perfectly okay. But in the world of aviation, assertiveness is actually equally as important in a fellowship role, like in the role as a first officer, as it is in the captain role. Now, by this time in the 1990s, airlines around the world had begun crew resource management, or CRM training, which teaches crew techniques for clear communication and shared decision-making, among other things. But in practice, at plenty of airlines at that time, the hierarchical style of old still weighed in heavily. So if the captain had a strong opinion, most first officers might still just phrase a disagreement as a question, or not say anything at all. And that's worth remembering. Anyway, as the aircraft climbed towards its cruise altitude, the flight continued just as planned, with passengers in the back reading books and dozing off, whilst in the cockpit, routine chatter flowed as it always did. Navigational checks and cruise clearances were mixed up with the odd personal story. A perfectly normal day in the office, in other words. But below the aircraft, the monsoon season was now in full swing. Over India, thick layers of white and grey clouds stretched out for hundreds of miles, with tops reaching as high as 40,000 feet, and somewhere beneath those lay the flooded plains of Bihar and the foothills of Himalaya, rising up towards Nepal. For the two pilots, this was a familiar weather situation. Flights into Kathmandu often required holding because of the complicated weather patterns in this area, but they had also prepared for that by taking some extra fuel with them. The chart for Tribhuvan International Airport sat folded on the tray table with diagrams of the mountain valley, the VRDME beacon located at the airfield, as well as the steep approach that was necessary in order for them to get in. Now, this was not an easy airport to fly into, so the two pilots spent quite some time in the cruise reviewing altitudes, waypoints and the go-around procedure. The captain was a methodical man who liked to plan his approaches early on in order to prepare for contingencies. And that is actually a great habit to have, because when you brief early, you're basically buying yourself mental capacity for later on. And like I said, in this case, it would definitely be needed, since Flight 311 would soon start its descent into one of the most complex environments an airliner can face. A steep, non-radar, non-precision valley approach surrounded by high peaks and flown at high pressure altitude, meaning that the speeds would be higher than normal. At time 12:10, the first officer checked in with Kathmandu Area Control, reporting their position as about 150 nautical miles southeast of the airport. And one important thing to again highlight here is that none of the controllers in Kathmandu had access to neither primary or secondary radar. This meant that each aircraft had to state its distance and bearing from the VOR radio beacon at Tribhuvan Airport, and the controller would then use those reports to build a picture of where the aircraft under his control were, and then apply what's known as procedural separation between them. Now, there wasn't that much traffic flying into Kathmandu, so this system was sufficient to maintain adequate traffic flow and separation, but this also relied entirely on accurate reports from the crews, as well as very clear and constant communication. So, if a crew would misreport their location or lose radio contact, well, then the controller would have no way to correct them, or even to know what their actual position was. Now, at the time Flight 311 was approaching Kathmandu, the weather was reasonably good for the season, with a broken cloud cover between 2,500 and 10,000 feet, visibility more than 10 kilometers and light easterly winds, which was perfect for the planned approach into runway 02 that the pilots had in mind. So when the controller passed on this weather update, the first officer just read it back and the captain acknowledged it. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 8 minutes later, at time 12:18, the crew decided that they were now ready to start the descent. There was no traffic below them, but even though they called the controller several times, they initially received no reply back. It was later discovered that this wasn't a technical fault that could be blamed on the mountains or the weather. No, the controller simply wasn't paying attention here. So it took half a dozen attempts to get a response, and when the controller finally replied, quite some frustration could be heard in the voice of the pilot. Now this I completely understand, because we normally call for descent a few miles before we reach our calculated top of descent in order to get a smooth transition and avoid ending up hot and high. So if these pilots had to ask 6 times, they were likely already above their calculated profile for no reason at all, something that we pilots really find annoying. On top of that, by time 12:23, the weather south of Kathmandu had now also started declining rapidly. Visibility along the runway 02 approach path had suddenly dropped to barely a kilometer in heavy rain, but the conditions were slightly better to the north, where breaks in the clouds still allowed limited visual contact with the valley. Because of this, and because the wind had now also shifted almost 180 degrees, the controller informed the crew that the straight-in approach to runway 02 was now not available, and he instead offered them the alternative circling procedure for runway 20. You see, Kathmandu's Tribhuvan Airport sits in a bowl of mountains and only has one runway. It's labeled 02 when approached from the south and 20 when approached from the north, and most flights, especially in poor weather, landed from the south using what's called a VOR DME approach. That name is derived from the two radio beacons that guide the airplanes towards the runway. The VOR, a very high frequency omnidirectional range, broadcasts a signal that tells a pilot what direction the aircraft is on from the beacon using what's known as a radial. Each radial is essentially a magnetic line expanding outwards from the VOR like a spoke on a wheel, and every degree represents a specific magnetical radial, numbered from 001 to 360. When pilots tune their VOR instruments to that beacon, they can then tell their relative position from it and also choose to fly on a specific radial towards it or from it. The second radio beacon, the DME or distance measuring equipment, gives the distance in nautical miles to the VOR, and combined, these two can be used to create a precise horizontal path towards the runway. But only horizontal. That means that the pilots must still manage their descent manually following a specific profile that they get from their approach chart, which specifies step-down fixes at certain distances from the beacon, where minimum altitudes are depicted to keep the aircraft safe from the surrounding hills. One of those fixes on this approach, a point called Sierra, stipulated the beginning of the final part of the descent down towards the minimum descent altitude, and the minimum altitude there was 9,500 feet. After that, the aircraft could descend down to 8,200 feet at the 8-mile marker, 6,800 feet at the 6-mile marker, and so on until they reached the MDA, where they had to see the runway in order to continue visually. Now, if they couldn't, then a missed approach procedure would have to be executed immediately, climbing away from the valley to the northwest and then turn back towards the south in order to avoid the mountains rising on every other side. Now, from the opposite side, there was no published approach procedure, since on that side lay the massive Himalayan mountains, whose peaks reached tens of thousands of feet. This meant that the only way to land on runway 20 was by first flying that same VOR approach down to runway 02, then hopefully break out from the clouds and follow what's known as a circling approach visually to land on the opposite runway. Now, that requires extremely precise maneuvering to stay south of the mountains, and the airport must also be in sight during this entire time, since this is a visual maneuver. In good conditions, that circling maneuver was challenging but safe, but in monsoon weather, with cloud layers hanging just above the ridges and rain blurring the valley, it was the kind of approach that every pilot tries to avoid. This meant that the captain was not very happy when he got this new weather update. He asked again if there would be any possibility for them to use runway 02, but the controller just replied that they must use runway 20. This caused the captain to start thinking about their fuel and alternates. If that rain didn't clear soon, he needed to know what contingencies they had in case they needed to wait for the weather to improve and for runway 02 to reopen. So he now asked the first officer, fuel for Calcutta, how much to get back? The first officer looked through the flight plan and soon responded that they had enough fuel on board to go all the way back to Bangkok. But that wasn't what the captain had asked for, so he snapped back, Calcutta, how much? Now, the reason for this was that he wanted to know how long that he could afford to wait, circling over Kathmandu, which would require subtracting the diversion fuel for Calcutta from their total fuel. So just hearing that they had enough to return to Bangkok didn't really help him. After a pause, the first officer then came back with that info that the captain had asked for, and the cockpit fell quiet again. But this was a quite brief exchange showing the kind of dynamic that was present in this cockpit, with a captain that could be a bit harsh and a slightly submissive first officer. In any case, at time 12:27, the flight crossed the Romeo fix, which was an RNAV point 41 nautical miles south of Kathmandu, and depicted on the pilot's chart as part of the approach, even though it really wasn't. The two pilots continued reviewing the runway 02 VOR procedure, tracing the step-downs on the chart, and during that review the captain made a small but telling slip. He referred to the approach radial as 022 instead of 202. Now 022 was the inbound course they needed to follow on the 202 radial, so it was an easy mistake to make, but I still want you to keep that in mind. The pilots then also reviewed the missed approach procedure one more time, just in case they would need it, and according to their charts, if they couldn't land, they needed to first climb straight ahead, then make a sweeping 270-degree right turn and roll out on a heading of 291 degrees. And after that, they had to continue towards a holding point called Whiskey, northwest of the airport. This was a relatively straightforward maneuver, but one that was important to fly correctly in order to keep them clear of the mountains to the north at all costs. But both pilots hoped that they wouldn't need to fly it. At around time 12:30, the first officer called up the approach controller again to ask for the latest visibility. But instead of giving them a number, this time the controller just replied that runway 02 was also available, implying that the conditions had now improved enough to allow it. The first officer began to respond, but before he could finish, the captain cut in onto the radio himself and said, "Confirm runway 02 available." "Affirm," came the reply back from the controller. So the captain immediately followed up with, "Request present visibility." Now from this moment on, he was both flying and communicating on the radio, while at the same time the first officer was also trying to handle the radio since he was pilot monitoring and therefore should be the one handling that. This was a procedural breach that actually increased the captain's workload just as they were approaching the most demanding part of this flight. But he likely did this because he was a bit frustrated with his first officer's timid handling of the radio, and he clearly felt that more direct communication was needed. Anyway, the controller initially ignored the captain's question, asking instead for their distance from the airport. The captain repeated, 25 DME now, request present visibility. But rather than answering, the controller just told them to contact Kathmandu Tower, since the flight was now inside 25 miles and therefore within the tower's airspace. At this point, with the weather apparently improving to the south, the captain decided to attempt the approach after all, instead of holding. So he began asking the first officer to configure the aircraft step by step, eventually calling for flaps 15 to be selected. But then, at time 12:33, as the aircraft descended through the thick clouds towards the valley, something unexpected suddenly happened. A fault message appeared on the system display, accompanied by a loud chime, and the flaps stopped moving before reaching the commanded 15-degree position. Now this was a big problem. You see, the descent angle needed to fly one of the segments of this approach into runway 02 was 6.6 degrees, more than double the normal 3-degree approach angle used for landing at traditional airports. And that steep segment required full flaps to be selected in order to provide the necessary drag to be able to do it. So instead of continuing the descent, the captain now leveled off at 10,500 feet to help the first officer work through this problem. The ECAM message only told the crew to check the QRH, and when they reached for the quick reference handbook, it offered nothing useful, just procedures for landing with limited flaps, not for actually restoring them in flight. But it did tell them to switch the flap inhibit switch on the ground proximity warning system to inhibit, in order to avoid erroneous flap-related warnings. And that's also worth remembering. In any case, as the pilots discussed their options, the airplane continued in level flight, soon passing the point where they would have needed to continue their descent in order to follow the path down towards the runway. This meant that the captain soon realized that it was now too late to make a landing, so he just said to his colleague, "We've got to have the configuration, we cannot land." At time 12:33, he then also called up the tower and said, "Thai 311, request to maintain 10,500 and request back to Calcutta due to technical." The controller replied, "Understand Thai 311 like to divert to Calcutta due to technical?" But at this point, the first officer tried to retract the flaps to 0 and then select them to 15 again, and that seemed to do the trick, because 20 seconds later, the fault just cleared. The amber line disappeared and the flaps extended normally. Now, this entire episode had lasted less than half a minute, but during that time, the calm, methodical flow of the approach had been broken, and the flight was now way too high to continue the approach. But since the aircraft now seemed to work fine again, the captain abandoned his plan to divert and instead decided to return back to the beginning of the approach and start it all over again. Which was a pretty reasonable thing to do given that they had plenty of fuel and that the weather was now improving. We'll turn back to Romeo and start our approach again, he said. But here, a crucial misunderstanding began to take shape. You see, the waypoint Romeo sat 41 nautical miles south of Kathmandu, far beyond the start of the runway 02 Sierra approach that they had been flying, which began only 16 miles away from the beacon. But the captain likely mistook Romeo for the 16-mile fix that marked the beginning of the Sierra approach, because on their internal company chart, both Sierra and Romeo were depicted very close together, separated only by a small gap in the printed line with a label saying "Scale Distorted." And that label was likely quite easy to miss. This meant that to the captain, the Romeo point looked like the start of the approach, and that's likely why he wanted to go there. He didn't realize that Romeo was more than twice the distance away. When the captain radioed in his intention to go to Romeo, the controller, who, remember, could only rely on radio reports to determine their position, just cleared them to start a new Sierra approach. The Romeo point was so far away from the airport that it was even outside of the approach controller's range and would therefore require handing back Flight 311 to the area controller. So, understandably here, the controller couldn't initially understand why Flight 311 was requesting to go there. It's possible that he didn't even understand the request at first. Now, as it turns out, in Kathmandu, that kind of confusion was quite easy to fall into. Remember, the controllers at Tribhuvan didn't have access to radar, so they couldn't see where anyone was or assign specific headings. Their job was simply to clear aircraft to perform published procedures, like the Sierra VOR DME approach, and to keep traffic separated by altitude or reported distance. How a crew actually got from one waypoint to the next was entirely up to them. So this all meant that when the captain asked for a left turn back to Romeo, the controller didn't see a big problem. From his perspective, this was just another request to begin the Sierra approach again, and he therefore just cleared the flight accordingly. Thai 311, cleared Sierra approach, report 10 DME leaving 9500. But by saying it in that way, a critical misunderstanding now took place. You see, the captain now thought that the controller was authorizing them to continue the same approach that they were already flying, which was impossible now that they were too high to land. But in reality, the controller had given them exactly what he had asked for, a clearance to turn back and start the Sierra approach again. But the captain just didn't understand that. So he now came back on the radio trying to clarify. We can't land at this time, we have to left turn back to Romeo again and start our approach again. Roger, the controller replied. Go ahead with your DME distance. We are 9 DME, 10,500 feet, the captain responded. Understand, 9 DME, 10,500 feet? The controller repeated back. Now, as you can hear, this exchange was going nowhere, fueled by a lack of understanding between the two people that were communicating. This also meant that the captain's tone soon started growing a bit sharper. Answer please, he snapped, directing his frustration towards the controller who, to him, seemed unwilling to acknowledge what he was asking for. We'll maintain 10-5, the first officer transmitted on the radio. Then, glancing out the window, he asked quietly, are we clear of the MOCA, the minimum obstacle clearance altitude? How about on the left? This was a clear indication that he was now worried about the terrain in the area, as the MOCA is one of the altitudes we use as minimums to ensure that we always have an acceptable terrain clearance. Yeah, I can see it, the captain replied, still focused on his instrument, awaiting an acceptable clearance from the controller. He now took the radio back again and said, left turn now? Go ahead with your DME distance, came the same unhelpful reply back. Remember, the controller had already given him a valid clearance and was now just awaiting their distance check on their next approach. 7 DME now, the first officer reported. Trying again, request left turn back. Roger, 10 DME, copy sir. Report 16 DME leaving 11.5. the controller answered, while still not approving or denying the turn, because, of course, in a non-radar environment, he couldn't issue any vectors, even if he had understood what was being asked from him. So this pattern just kept repeating itself. Polite radio calls were met with vague replies, and it's also important to remember that none of the involved parties here spoke English as their first language. This meant that the controller probably didn't have the English vocabulary to explain his confusion, so he instead just kept repeating similar phrases, hoping that the pilots would eventually do what they thought best. And the captain didn't seem to fare much better. Language proficiency isn't just about vocabulary. It's also about possessing the ability to say, "I don't understand," and getting the other side to clarify. And that was now failing miserably. Both sides of this conversation thought that they understood each other perfectly, forming what we pilots now would call a closed-loop information failure. Information was sent with verification, but also with the assumption that the other side received and understood all of the relevant information, which they clearly didn't. Anyway, at time 12:35, the captain finally decided to stop waiting and just said, "We climb ahead." He reached for the autopilot's heading selector and turned it several turns to the right, commanding the plane to initially roll onto a heading of 045 degrees heading northeast. Now that was likely just an interim heading, which he wanted to fine-tune further to the right later on, and simultaneously he also began a climb, apparently following the logic of the missed approach procedure, which called for a right-hand climbing turn that went through 270 degrees to take them to the Whiskey Point. The only problem was that the missed approach was meant to start over the VOR at the airport not 5 miles south of it, where they now were. But as long as they were flying in heading select, that didn't really matter much. But it is interesting to note here that up until this point, the crew had been asking for left turns, but they now still chose to turn right. It is possible that this had to do with the lower terrain to the west of the flight path, but that as the flight progressed closer to the airport, the captain just instead elected to follow a profile closer to the missed approach. If that was the case, the crew had maintained good terrain situational awareness all the way up until this point. In any case, soon a new call came from the tower, asking the crew to report leaving 16 DME for the approach. And that was then followed by a misunderstanding from the first officer and corrections from the controller, all of which would have taken up more time and likely distracted the captain further. At this point, he still seemed to believe that the tower's instruction meant for them to continue descending on that original approach that they had now left. So he again now broke in on the radio and tried to clarify by saying, "We cannot make the approach now. We will be turning right and climbing to 18,000 feet in order to start the approach again." And that, the report that the flight was climbing to 18,000 feet, took the controller completely by surprise. He responded, "Roger, stand by for the time being. Maintain 115 due to traffic." And the reason for his now sudden nervousness was that there was another flight, Royal Nepal Flight 206, that was now descending through the sector south of Kathmandu, about to start that very same procedure. And as I mentioned before, in a non-radar environment like this, separation was maintained through altitude assignments tied to each phase of the approach or departure. So as long as Thai Flight 311 maintained 11,500 feet, it would remain safely below Nepal Flight 206's flight path in that segment, but not if they climbed higher. In other words, the controller absolutely didn't want Flight 311 to climb above 11,500 feet until the other aircraft was clear of the area, and they also couldn't authorize a descent back towards Kathmandu until Thai 311 had re-entered the published procedure. So the approach controller now simply told them to maintain the altitude that they were supposed to have and stand by, which from a terrain separation point of view was perfectly okay to the south of the airport. The problem though was that Flight 311 had already climbed through 13,000 feet when this message was received. But the first officer just replied, "Okay, we'll maintain 13,000 now." The controller replied, "Roger, and then repeated, initially maintain 11.5 due to traffic, RA206, estimating Simara 57 from Delhi, descending to flight level 150. The first officer acknowledged this and said, descend to 11.5, we are now 8 DME. The aircraft briefly now leveled off on a southeasterly heading of about 130 degrees before starting to descend back down towards their cleared altitude, but the confusion on the frequency still hadn't fully cleared up. The tower controller soon asked again, Type 311, understand you'd like to proceed Romeo to make an approach? And to that the captain replied, affirm, request confirm, proceed to Romeo. Proceed to Romeo, contact area control, came the response back, and just to highlight why this forth and back was so important, it was going on as the captain was now both turning right, descending and taking some of the radio calls, so his workload was likely much higher than it should be, which might explain what happened next. Down on the ground in the tower at Tribhuvan Airport, the tower controller now phoned the area control center to pass along what he thought that he had understood. Thai 311 was unable to make approach and is proceeding back to Romeo. The area controller was understandably confused by this. Romeo wasn't at the start of the approach procedure, it wasn't even part of the procedure, so why was the flight proceeding there? And to that, the tower controller simply replied that this was what the crew had requested. Now, I completely understand the approach controller's skepticism here. Taking such a long detour to a waypoint 40 miles away without any real purpose must have seemed super strange, but with no radar and a professional instinct not to second guess another controller's exchange with the crew, there wasn't much more to say. If they wanted to fly to that detour, well then that was up to them. As this handoff was occurring, the captain stayed focused on trying to extract a coherent instruction from the controllers. But between the stress, the language barrier and his frustration with the lack of clear instruction, his attention had likely drifted a little bit away from his actual flight path. Now, he had been manually twisting the heading bug to the right, but in between all of what was going on, he hadn't stopped twisting it when it was pointing towards the Sierra Point. Instead, he continued through 108 degrees, then 270, and finally a nearly full circle. Now, this obviously couldn't have been his initial intention, but several factors likely contributed to why it still happened. First, like I already pointed out, the workload was high as he did this. He was trying to get his aircraft pointing the correct way in clouds and among mountainous terrain, whilst also handling every other radio transmission himself, convinced that the controllers weren't understanding him, and that his first officer couldn't get himself understood. Secondly, he might have transposed the two critical radials needed in his head, the 202 degree inbound radial and the 022 degree reciprocal. That's a simple reversal, one that any pilot could make under stress, but in this case it meant that instead of turning back towards the southwest, he was now slowly steering towards the northeast, towards the rising mountain sides of Himalaya beyond the airport. As the aircraft rolled out on its new heading of about 025 degrees, the confusion on the radio finally subsided. The captain keyed his mic, heading 025, altitude 11.5. And before making that call, the two pilots had cross-checked their altitude against their charts. And they had confirmed that 11,500 feet would keep them above the minimum safe altitude for the southern sector of the approach. And that was another sign that both of these pilots now believed that they were heading south of Kathmandu. Had they realized that they were now instead heading towards the north, they would have seen that the minimum safe altitude for that sector was over 21,000 feet, almost 10,000 feet above their current altitude. Now, those of you who have paid attention so far would have heard that the captain actually reported that he was heading 025 degrees. And that should have raised all sorts of alarm bells for both the crew and the controllers. But for some strange reason, it didn't. In case of the controllers, they probably just didn't pick up that particular number in the midst of all of the other information that the crew had recently shared with them. And in the case of the crew, they were still slightly distracted by other factors that I will soon explain. And 025 was close to the correct approach track, the one that they had flown before and which they had earlier briefed. So it is possible that the enormous threat that this heading now represented just wasn't immediately clear. They had simply lost their situational awareness, and it was soon about to get worse. At time 12:41, the controller called the flight up and said, "Confirmed your DME from Kathmandu?" The captain again took the radio and replied, "We are 5 DME from Kathmandu." But hearing this deeply confused the controller. If Flight 311 really was turning back towards Romeo, their DME distance should now be increasing, not decreasing. And since the last report 4 minutes ago had placed them at 9 DME, they should now be roughly 20 miles further away. So, thinking that he must have misheard, the controller now keyed his mic again and asked, "Confirm 25 DME?" And the deeply frustrated captain now replied angrily, 505. Now, hearing his tone, the controller merely accepted this and chose not to argue or ask for any further clarification. Instead, he just responded, 5 DME, Roger, Tide 311, maintain 11-5, report over Romeo. And this was a huge missed opportunity to pick up the mistake that was now taking place. You see, in reality, the aircraft really was 5 DME away from the beacon, but not for the reason either side believed. After spending several minutes turning in confusion whilst also descending and discussing with ATC, Flight 311 had flown slightly to the west of Kathmandu VOR and had then continued north without realizing it. So the DME had counted steadily down towards 0 as they approached the beacon and had then started counting back up again once they had passed it. Now, if the crew noticed that reversal at all, they probably assumed it just confirmed their own theory, that they had overshot the airport slightly to the north and were now heading back south, away from it. But obviously, in reality, they were now moving in exactly the opposite direction, proceeding deeper into the Himalayas, while both of the pilots and the controllers believed that they were safely on the southern side of the valley. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the first officer was now trying to program their course back to Romeo into their flight management system. But he was struggling to make sense of what the navigation system was showing him. He typed Romeo into the computer, expecting the waypoint to appear in front of him on the map. But it just didn't. The captain kept insisting, "Please, find Romeo for me." And the first officer therefore inputted it again and then scrolled through a list of waypoints named Romeo and asked if the one near 27 degrees north latitude was correct. The captain checked his chart and confirmed that it was. So the first officer selected it on top and then pressed the Direct To button, which should have drawn a course line from their current position to that waypoint. Now, what the display actually showed them isn't recorded. But if the system was working correctly, it should have drawn a turn back the way that they had come from, going behind them and out of view. The Airbus's FMS could only show waypoints within an 85-degree arc in front of the aircraft, so anything behind it, including the Romeo and Simara waypoints, both south of Kathmandu, simply wouldn't appear, except for the initial turns to get there. This was a simple limitation of the display, but to the crew, now completely stuck in their confirmation bias of being headed in the correct direction, this might have instead looked like a fault. If the captain had realized that they were actually now north of Kathmandu, heading further north, what they now saw would have made perfect sense, but his reaction suggested that the result just didn't fit the picture that he had in his head. So instead of executing the turn likely indicated, he now told the first officer to try again. He was convinced that the computer was malfunctioning or that the first officer was just selecting the wrong waypoint. Now, there is also a possibility here that the captain had the Rose mode selected on his navigation display, which is a mode primarily used to fly VOR approaches and commonly used at Thai Airways at the time. And if that was the case, he might not have had such a clear picture in front of him of what the first officer was programming. Instead, his screen would have shown a magnetic line set to whatever radial he had selected, which was likely 025 as that was the inbound course of the approach that they had just flown. In any case, the first officer now tried another waypoint nearby called Simara, but the result was the same. it doesn't show Simara at all," he exclaimed in frustration. And meanwhile, the captain's confusion also grew deeper, since the distance shown by the flight management system to the inputted waypoint wouldn't have made any kind of sense to him. If Romeo was near the start of the approach, about 16 miles away from the VOR, then he should see a short distance displayed, since the distance from the VOR according to the DME display was now almost 16 nautical miles. But because Romeo actually lay dozens of miles south of Kathmandu, and they were now flying further to the north by every passing second, the number in the computer was now far larger than he expected. So the captain now exclaimed, "Romeo is how many miles from here?" But the first officer just replied, "We get it, it works direct." Since the line towards Romeo was visible on the display, it just didn't appear where the captain thought that it should. But he was, however, still determined to trust his own interpretation of their position, and therefore said, "Romeo, radial 202, 16 DME, wait, I will follow the line." Now what he meant by the line may have been the 022 radial from the Kathmandu VOR, the northward extension of the same 202-degree radial used for the runway 02 approach, and the one that he still might have had on his route display. But sadly, we will never really know for sure. Anyway, following the 022 radial meant flying north, directly away from the airport and straight towards the highest terrain in the region. The navigation line pointed south in the direction back to safety, but to the captain, who believed that he was already south of Kathmandu and flying on a southerly track, that just couldn't be right. So convinced that the equipment was now in error, he ignored it and kept flying in the same direction, likely now planning to intercept the inbound radial manually after reaching what he interpreted as the correct point. Obviously, watching this from the comfort of our own sofas, this looks crazy, right? But the problem is that once a particular scenario has entered into someone's mind, the brain will do whatever it can to confirm that theory as being correct. And that includes disregarding obvious signs of it being wrong, like strange DME readings or odd FMS behavior. On top of that, the fact that the controllers hadn't warned them was probably then seen as a further proof that they were doing the right thing. A textbook example of confirmation bias. In modern crew CRM training, we pilots are taught to recognize this trap by following some quite simple guidelines. Always challenge assumptions, especially when something doesn't add up. When the data and your mental model disagree, that's the moment to stop, speak up, and re-evaluate together as a crew. Effective crew resource management isn't about who is right, it's about what is right, and ensuring that both pilots have the same correct mental picture of the reality. Anyway, at time 12:43, the captain called up the approach controller once again and reported TIE 311, 14 DME. And the controller, hearing that the distance was now increasing, relaxed a bit. This new number fit his expectation. Flight 311 was outbound, heading away from Kathmandu and towards the Romeo waypoint. TIE 311, maintain 115, report over Romeo, he instructed. But obviously this was only reassuring to him because he had no way of knowing that it was increasing in the wrong direction. Inside the cockpit though, things were still far from settled. The airplane was now actually nearing the point where the captain believed that the Sierra approach should begin, 16 miles south of the field. So he, believing that they were dealing with some strange issue with their flight management computer, now likely prepared to reverse course for the next approach and fly it raw data, meaning without the use of the computer, only based on the nav aids. So he turned the heading knob a few clicks to the left, almost due north from 025 degrees to 005 degrees, likely setting up what he thought would be the entry teardrop for a course reversal, and he also now reduced the speed slightly. The first officer, meanwhile, was still fighting the flight management system and said, "This thing fails again." No matter what he entered, the screen refused to display the waypoints where he expected them to be. Eventually, the captain said, "Transfer it from my side," meaning that he wanted the first officer to pull over the waypoints that the captain believed he had correctly entered. "Yeah, we had transferred it, but it is gone, same as before," said the first officer in response. Both men were now staring at the navigation display, unable to understand why nothing was appearing, but as we all know, the system wasn't malfunctioning at all. But a few seconds later, something on the first officer's instrument suddenly caught his attention. We will never know what it was. Maybe he saw something out of the window, or maybe he noticed the standby compass, but he suddenly asked with minor alarm creeping into his voice, "Hey, we're going north?" Unknown to the crew, the aircraft had at this point already entered into a box canyon from which there would be no escape. Their fate was now sealed, because behind the clouds now stood only massive sheer cliffs on three sides, reaching more than 20,000 feet high. But there were still no indications of that in the cockpit. The captain, still confident in his mental map, brushed this question off, clearly not understanding the gravity of what his first officer had just revealed. He just said, "We will turn back soon," and then keyed his microphone saying, "Kathmandu, Thai 311 request right turn back to the airfield." But before the controller could answer that call, a sharp electronic voice broke through the cockpit speakers. "Terrain," quickly followed by all up. This was a ground proximity warning system, which had now sensed that the aircraft had a too high closure rate to the terrain below them, and was therefore screaming at them to climb. But even though this warning was absolutely correct, to the captain it still sounded false. Even though his radar altimeter was now also quickly reducing, he likely believed that the system was reacting to one of the steep valleys south of Kathmandu's airport, not to the box canyon that they were actually in. And that wasn't actually completely crazy. You see, the GPWS that was fitted to this aircraft could often be triggered by the large sudden changes in terrain directly below the aircraft, since it only used a small beam of radar pointed directly downwards. It was nothing like the vastly enhanced database-enabled eGPWS that we use in today's aircraft in order to predict obstacles ahead of us. And it is possible that this system had given the captain spurious warnings in this area before. Also, remember how the crew had been dealing with that flap problem earlier? Well, like I said, part of that procedure included disabling part of the GPWS connected to the flap configuration to avoid spurious warnings. So it is possible that the captain remembered that point and therefore somehow mixed it into this very real warning that had nothing to do with flaps. In any case, he did now select level change, indicating a willingness to climb, and as he was doing so, the first officer started shouting, "Turn back! Turn back!" "It's false, it's false," the captain insisted, and the Airbus just continued level at 11,500 feet, straight towards the mountainside in front of them. Like I said before, even if they had executed a terrain escape maneuver or tried to turn at this point, the investigation later showed that it wouldn't have worked. The GPWS alert continued repeating itself over the next 17 seconds. "Terrain, all up." And then, as the clouds suddenly broke, the mountain appeared like a great grey wall, filling their entire windshield. There was no time to react. The final words captured on the cockpit voice recorder was just a sharp gasp. "Oh no!" At 12:45 local time, at a speed of over 230 knots, Thai Airways Flight 311 rammed straight into a nearly vertical cliffside of the 18,700 feet Mount Baden-Powell Massif, 23 miles north of Kathmandu. The aircraft disintegrated completely on impact, and all 113 people on board were instantly killed. The impact was so sudden and violent that outside of a quick flash of ignited fuel, there was barely any fire. The controllers kept calling for the next few minutes, unaware that the plane that they thought was heading south had now actually flown directly into the Himalayas. It took 2 full days to find the wreckage. Rescue teams scoured the valleys south of Kathmandu in the area where everyone believed that the airplane had gone down, but found nothing. It was only when word trickled out from some remote villages to the north about a strange explosion that helicopters finally managed to locate a dark scar high up on a cliffside. The aircraft had hit an area so remote and so steep that even reaching it was nearly impossible. So when investigators finally arrived, they soon found themselves working one of the most inaccessible crash sites on Earth. The air was thin, the slopes treacherous, and the weather unpredictable. And at that altitude, even simple tasks were understandably exhausting. One investigator actually died of altitude sickness whilst on the mountain, which was a tragic and further sobering reminder of how unforgiving this terrain could really be. The cause of the crash was determined to be the flight crew's loss of navigational situational awareness. They simply got lost, victims of confusion, poor communication and confirmation bias. Luckily today, this kind of accident would be almost impossible. Because 2 years after Flight 311, GPS-based navigation began to appear in commercial cockpits, giving pilots an exact fix of their position anywhere on Earth. And now, flight management computers can show an aircraft's location with near pinpoint accuracy, with every procedure around Kathmandu being GPS-based. Enhanced ground proximity warning systems, also known as EGPWS, have now also transformed terrain awareness. Unlike the simple radar altimeter-based systems of the early 1990s, modern systems now use detailed terrain databases and satellite position data to look ahead of the flight path, giving both a map depiction of high terrain around and much earlier warnings of impending terrain impacts. But maybe the most lasting legacy of Flight 311 lies in how the crews are trained. Crew resource management wasn't a new idea in 1992, it was already being taught in much of the world, but Flight 311 stands as a powerful case study in why it matters. Every step of this accident shows how easily two experienced, competent pilots could become trapped inside of the same false picture, each reinforcing the other's belief instead of challenging it. Today, CRM is woven into every phase of flight training, as well as the job that we pilots do every single day. We are now taught not only to monitor our instruments, but to also monitor each other's thinking and to speak up whenever something doesn't make sense, even if hierarchy or habit makes that a little bit uncomfortable. And that's something that I really want every one of you to take with you from this video. Now, if you want to support the work that my team and I do, please support our sponsor by checking out the link below. It's a great deal, and you can also support us by joining my Patreon crew using this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I'm actually just getting ready for another hangout and I would love to see you there. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.